Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and Rob from Transcendent Psych, his own channel there, where he talks about psychological stuff, philosophical stuff, and stuff. Here we are talking. I know some of you are already in the live chat, either drowning your sorrows, or happy, or nonplussed, or on the other side of the world thinking, what's all this about? Rob, how are you, my good friend?
I'm very good, thank you, Joe. I've actually got no idea, apart from something a mutual friend of ours posted on Facebook about 20 minutes ago, what's going on.
Really?
Actually,
So
no,
I've just got back from the pub. I've had a few
TV.
pints. Excuse my my quasi inebriated state. But let's have a look at the exit polls. With Dr. Battery, hello, my good man. Hey, JP and Rob. Thanks for popping in. Hello from Slovakia. We already have an F the Tories. What a night from one of the viewers. And on the other hand, we have a little whiskey shop. If you ever want to buy whiskey or gin, here's a guy you want to buy it from in Stockbridge. If you're in the UK, Tory self-destructed. He said he's drowning his sorrows in a whiskey himself. He said Tory self-destructed, aided by COVID, energy crisis and war in Ukraine. No country parliament has shone in the past 5 years, but people don't see that. Just see things are bad. We're going to come back to that interesting viewpoints, but let's have a look at what the exit poll is. So the exit poll is, I know this is teaching your grandmother to suck eggs, but as soon as people come out of the polling booth, they poll them, ask them who they voted for, and actually they have got better and better at doing exit polls to the point that they are pretty accurate these days. And so this is what the exit poll is showing at the moment for the election. A Labour landslide is predicted. I am quite happy at my own predictions because I said it's going to be on the lower side of the landslide, which it is, I think. Conservatives have got more than was predicted by many of the pollsters. The Reform Party have a load more. So what absolutely jumps out at me is that Reform have done really well, Conservatives have done slightly better, and SNP have not done well. So just to remind people, for the viewers from around the world here, the UK has 650 constituencies split over England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland have devolved parliaments, and they also have slightly different parties that run there. For example, Plaid Cymru in Wales, and they are on track to take 4 seats, which I think is up from their last allotment. SNP are getting much less than they have got at the moment. And Northern Ireland is quite different. So where you have 25 other parties, that's predominantly going to be the Northern Irish parties there. And the Labour are going to have a huge majority. You need 326 for a majority. So they are not quite at 100 seat majority. So it is a good win, but it's not quite what was expected by most of the pollsters. And as I say, that was pretty much what I said last night, although I think Reform have a few more seats. So that's going to be interesting. Rob, what do you think about these initial, this exit poll?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think a surprise there. For Labour, I think we've all been thinking there's going to be pretty much a landslide or a supermajority, to import the US jargon. But I was actually predicting that Conservatives might do a little bit better. I certainly thought Reform was going to do a lot better than people were saying. I think he probably got much more of a shy Reform vote trend than a conservative, shy conservative trend.
So what's interesting with Reform is that I think they would have eaten into a lot of the Labour votes in certain constituencies, particularly up north. Will that be enough to unseat the Labour from winning those seats, particularly the ones to win back from the Tories? So all these dynamics, such as the war in Israel and how that might affect the Muslim vote that often goes to Labour, particularly in these northern seats as well. So if the Muslim vote goes from Labour to say the Green Party or Lib Dem, and the Reform vote takes some Labour and also the Tory vote, you might well get a lot more Reform seats than you might have thought. And that looks to be what's happened. So the predictions were for about 5 Reform seats, Nigel Farage's party, and to go from sort of 5 at the most of the pollsters were saying 5 or 6 was the top Reform number, to go to 13 at the exit polls. That is a very good result for Reform indeed. And that means that if they got that, they would be a somewhat meaningful, play a meaningful part in Parliament. And SNP going to below Reform, I think, is really significant. As Alistair Fitchie here says, I'm in Scotland, just finished my 16-hour stint in a polling station, but it keeps giving everyone my name, so can't tell anything. Well, thank you for helping with the election. That's excellent stuff. Clive Dunning, by the way, Clive, it's so good to see you recently. I really appreciate you popping on to talk. But there you go. Anything else initially, Rob?
Well, just doing some maths there while you were doing that. I was thinking, depends, I suppose, which way you think the SNP might vote a bit in terms of the size of the opposition if this goes through. Would be an interesting question. So we've got roughly, my maths is only good, about 205 seats on that basis there. But I guess it depends on who sides with who.
So the Lib Dems have actually got a really good showing here. This would be a fantastic showing for them, and that's because they've done a lot because of the first past the post voting system. They get normally spanked in elections, whereby they get sort of 11% of the votes, but get sort of 5% of the MPs, or maybe even less. So this is good for the Lib Dems. Now, there was talk that they might even overtake the Conservatives to become the second biggest party. And the fact that they are under half of the Conservative MPs here in the exit poll, and of course, we'll talk about how inaccurate the exit polls might be in a second. That shows you how well the Conservatives have done, considering some of the ranges that were talked about with how dooming it was going to be.
Because there was a point, wasn't there, where it could have been Reform as the, Conservative, Reform, Liberals.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So the one seat that's coming famously in the UK, there's a race to see who can return their results first, and it's often Sunderland. And indeed, they were the first to call it, and it was. So more detail now. The result just declared in Houghton and Sunderland South in the county of Tyne and Wear. So this is up the northeast. Labour's Bridget Phillipson won that with 18,847. Now, what's important here is that Reform came second, and I think they came second by quite a margin, which is really significant. Reform came second with 11,668 of the votes there, and that tells you what kind of night I think we're going to have across the UK. Now, what's important to remember in both, I think, the exit polls and the what's called MRP polling. So MRP polling are the kind of constituency-wide polling that gives you the most granular data predictions of what will happen. There have been a lot of marginal seats where you've had really strong Tory Conservative majorities that have been destroyed by Reform and a resurgent Labour. There have been some very close margins. So the margin of error for both the MRP polling and for, I think, the exit poll is probably quite high. So the exit poll might well give you a little bit of a false sense of what's going on, because there are so many marginal seats. There's going to be a lot of leeway.
And that Sunderland seat, was that Conservative? Was that part of the Blue Wall?
No, I think so. It's a Labour hold, that one. So it was Labour, but that they've been beaten into Conservative being beaten into second, I think, is really significant. Someone's saying, can you click on all parties on the right hand corner? I can't see all parties there. See all parties. Here we go. Sorry. Yeah, that's not giving. Yeah, I think that's all Labour have got another one, so that's not giving all parties for the top, unfortunately. There, so this is, here you go. So the two that we've seen are up in the north. We've got Washington and Gateshead South, and there you go. That's that's the one. Oh no, Sunderland there. Sorry, Houghton and Sunderland South, and then Blythe and Ashington. So those are both, I presume, Labour holds. I get my head around this in a second. But Conservatives, as you can see, have taken a bit of a beating in the two that have shown so far. Labour are up, but this is really interesting. So Labour are probably going to get a landslide victory. And what you can see is that they've increased their vote share very marginally. So Labour are going to win big. Why? Because Reform have come along, and Reform are massively splitting the Conservative vote. If you think that essentially Reform are taking a large chunk, it might not be all of that 15%, because they will be bleeding to Lib Dems as well, the Conservatives, but maybe not up north, but further down south. I think what you're seeing is Reform basically winning this election for Labour. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
So there you go. Let's just have a look, see whether they are saying anything on the news. We can pop in to watch the BBC. We're going to share this instead. See if that...
particularly in the south of England. So now let's change to 2024.
Can you hear that?
And let's have a look and see what the exit poll is showing us. And look at those hexagons lowering. The Conservative seat majorities going down, being replaced by red ones. You've got, for example, Portsmouth North, Penny Mordaunt's seat just over there. Leader of the House of Commons has gone from quite a sizable Conservative hexagon to a red. So that is what we're looking at. It's an amazing map, that, isn't it? Because when
one Privy Councillor down,
all the same size, you get a real sense of just how much Labour red is covering the UK. And of course, the interesting thing as well is that you're seeing some marginal Conservative seats, which have been blue for a long time, turning into safe Labour. Back to you.
Jeremy, thank you.
So that was a interesting snippet from that, from the BBC there, and it looks like some of those majorities are quite sizable, and the majorities that the Conservatives do have are very small. Now, they just mentioned Penny Mordaunt in Portsmouth North. That is very local to me. Penny Mordaunt was running for Prime Minister. She didn't get it. Rishi Sunak is Prime Minister, but Penny Mordaunt has thrown herself into the mix a couple of times. She is strong on defence, and she would have been seen, I think, as a fairly safe pair of hands in terms of a Conservative MP. But if the likes of her are going to lose her seat, then basically no one is particularly safe for the Conservatives. There are another number of high-ranking Conservatives who are definitely vulnerable in this election. It's going to be really interesting to see who might lose out.
Interesting there as well, because I mean she's a potential sort of Tory leader candidate.
Yeah.
And I think she's been pitching herself. Well, she has pitched herself for that role before. So yeah, her versus Liz Truss at one. Liz Truss. Liz.
I don't think so.
Not Trust at one point. Yeah.
Yeah, so you are going to see. I mean, it's really interesting because there was talk before the election day of like, okay, so Conservatives are going to lose. Who is going to take over the leadership of the Conservative Party? And there was this feeling that they weren't ready to have that debate yet, because so many of the people who are would be running to lead the Conservative Party are potentially going to lose their seats. And so there's no point focusing on, I don't know, Cami Badenoch or Penny Mordaunt throwing a hat in the ring if they are not sure that they're going to even have a seat by the end of tonight or by the end of tomorrow. So also Rishi Sunak, what do you think Rishi Sunak will do now that it looks like the Conservatives are not going to prevail?
Move to California is the talk, I think. Yeah. Book his kind of after dinner speaking tours and write his biography.
Yeah, so he is pretty much a millionaire. His wife is incredibly loaded, and from a financial point of view, he doesn't need the job. Like if he keeps hold of his seat, which is a very kind of safe Richmond and Northallerton, isn't it? If he keeps that seat, then there was talk about him losing it, but I think the latest polls will have him keeping that seat. Then what's if you've been the prime minister, would you go back to being a backbencher in the opposition party? Like I don't think that's going to give you that kind of psychological drive. I think you'd wanting to be moving on to. He's not going to become prime minister again, right? So he's never going to get to the heights in politics that he was at. So I can't see him remaining in politics.
You might work for Sky TV, having put out a few adverts for them during the campaign.
Well, this is interesting. So I don't know, my international viewers might not know who some of these people are. So you've had this really interesting shift with the Conservative Party, whereby they have seen the threat coming from Reform, which is this populist right-wing party that has elements of policy on the left to attract some of the working class left-wing voters from Labour that they kind of had under the UKIP party. So Reform have come along, but they've generally threatened the Conservative Party more than Labour. And so the Conservatives have realised that this election is going to be very, very tough, and that their biggest threat is coming from the right. So how do you react to that? And people like Rory Stewart, who's a moderate Conservative who's now left the Conservative Party, said that, and in fact evidence supports this as well, is that rather than veering to the right to fight the far right, you should stay in the centre and be moderate and stake your claim for the centre ground. And that has better evidence behind it as being a more sensible position to take by looking at elections around the world. But actually, the Conservative Party did the opposite and said they went further to the right to fight off the surge of Reform. And so you had these big players like Cami Badenoch, Suella Braverman, who's a Home Secretary, Priti Patel, who's a former Home Secretary. Now, these are interesting people because they're all black and brown MPs, and they were adopting this very strong anti-immigration, very right-wing stance, which is an interesting dynamic in itself. And these are all three players, all women of colour, which is really fascinating, and all vying for Tory leadership going forward. And if they take the Conservative leadership on after this election, then you will see the Conservative Party move to the right. There's absolutely no doubt. And they will try and, I think, merge with the Reform to take on a much further to the right party, which then leaves moderate Conservatives without a home, arguably. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was just interested. I was just literally querying in my mind there the categorization that we have of immigration as a left and right issue anymore. I mean, when you consider Labour's position, it seems to be almost a national consensus across the parties of actually there's an appetite in the nation to change. You know, I mean, some people have made the point that actually in the last, I don't know, the time where the Huguenots were coming into the UK, the immigration numbers, we're letting in within 1 year the same number of immigrants that were brought in maybe over 10, 20 or whatever years during the Huguenot persecution in France. It's like, okay, so that's the narrative out there. That's the sort of thinking out there. And it seems to be shared to some extent, I would say, across left and right. And it's interesting, like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's to some degree. I think if you look at the Green Party, they're taking on a completely different approach to immigration, to be honest. And Lib Dems, I think, but yeah, I do get your point. I think Labour have had a lot of bleed to Reform because of immigration, essentially.
And it's interesting as well, isn't it? I suppose, classically as well, what you've just pointed out there about Badenoch and Braverman, that it's often the last wave of immigrants in particular that are the greatest opponents to the next waves of immigration historically.
Right. Interesting. I mean, so Andy, thanks for this, Andy S. He says, but conservatives don't want centre, we want conservative. This is where I'd have to disagree with you. I think you're speaking for your type of conservatism, but I can assure you that there are many one nation conservatives who would adopt the centre or slightly centre right ground, who would say that they are all for conserving traditions and the institutions of government, but they are also quite socially moderate. So Rory Stewart is a great example of that, and he's left the party because the party has done exactly that. So you talk about the great, Kenneth Baker and is that the right? No.
Ken Baker, yeah.
And all these others, Heseltine, all these sort of moderate conservatives who have seen the Conservative Party move to the right. Rory Stewart's very strong on this. He is very adamant that the Conservative Party's made the wrong decision in going further to the right, and he advocates for a sensible moderate conservatism. Now, that's not for everyone. So, for example, Andy here says, well, that's not my kind of conservatism. And what happens is you get a fraction of the party that means that either you have a very difficult broad tent that you have to control these disparate elements, or you need separate parties and you need something like proportional representation to better serve, to better represent those different kind of conservative viewpoints in this case.
Yeah, and when you see those kind of little cartoon type things, don't you, of like, how things have maybe moved to the left or right, but then people say actually the whole field has moved to the left. I know you might disagree with that. So actually, this is why I don't think it's nuanced enough, because it's like, do you mean economically? Do you mean
exactly? Yeah.
So I would say the conservatives with the capital C, they're neoliberals, but not actually very conservative with a small c. So then I'd say, like exactly like you've just said, really, Ken Baker's and all that, they believe in that sort of traditional preserving aspects of the past and keeping the things going on, being generally not too interventionist or what have you, standing by liberty,
but also believing in a strong welfare state, in the cultural kind of the heritage of say the NHS and the UK sort of post-war. We have a very different conservatism here to say American conservatism.
There should be a sort of care for the nation and the care for your neighbor and your brother and people, whereas that sort of more Thatcherite neoliberalism is more individualistic and more Reaganite.
It's really interesting. I saw an analysis on TLDR News that was really, they were talking about how Nigel Farage, interestingly, as leader of reform, but also someone who's been a campaigner for Donald Trump in the US, has tried to import some American political tendencies or strategies to the UK. And it's really interesting, like they tried to do a little bit of seeing whether abortion is something to get up in arms about. He also tried to suggest that there's electoral cheating taking place and that there's going to be widespread fraud, those kind of ideas. And it's interesting that they fell on deaf ears. Like that kind of strategizing actually doesn't work. You can't import that from the US. There are some cultural differences where things don't.
I'd have to check out what their source was of that, because I watched that. I had watched him in a discussion in a podcast with a bunch of young guys talking about postal voting, and he said that it's much better just to have everybody in the room and you can see everything that's going on. Whether there's a sort of implicit within that, I don't know. That's the thing they're jumping on. But the problem is, because he's more polemical as a party, I think he's one of those parties that people like to, you get the rumor mill going around of what they think or what they really mean and what they really say and stuff like that. So it's like actually just quite important to get the sources right, Yeah.
Well, there's an article here migration, voter fraud, and climate change. Farage's claims fact checked, so he has been fact checked on claims to do with voter fraud. But I think it's interesting. He is very much someone who's been ensconced in the American political system for some time, and I think you can't just lift ideas from the US. We are a different place. We've got a welfare system, so that kind of neoliberal conservatism in the UK, in the US, can't be lifted and imported into the UK, because I don't think the UK population are up for that. We have a much greater desire to have a welfare system that isn't so evident across the pond. But there you go.
It was interesting because I saw someone ask him, what's his relationship with Trump, and he was like, yeah, he's a good friend or whatever, he's a very funny man, yada yada. Yeah, sure. But it was like, they asked him about, do you think the election was rigged in the States? That's a Trumpist line. And he was like, basically, no. I wouldn't go that far. So I think he does distance between himself and Trump, even though wanting to keep him on side. So that's
but again, so Lib Dems, I think Lib Dems are going to be feeling pretty good about this. They have been... it's been a long time since I don't know the history of what their biggest seat haul has been, but this is going to be a good showing for them. What you might see after this election is a real clamour, like we said last night, I think, a real clamour for proportional representation, because what you'll have here is Reform getting really peed off that they've had such a massive number of votes, but only getting, say, 13 seats, which is still way better than they were predicted, but still falls very short of their vote share in representing their vote share. And you'll get Lib Dems always going to be complaining about that. You'll have the Green Party complaining about this. SNP not so much. They actually do quite well out first past the post system, and the Tories usually do well, and Labour can do well and also can suffer. So it's going to be really interesting whether Labour, who will probably benefit from first past the post for this election, whether they would do the right thing, because there are some people in the Labour Party who are keen on reforming our electoral system to get proportional representation of some variety or another, whether they will consider that as being the right thing to do, or whether they will try and look after their power by saying, no, we're going to keep first past the post, or maybe do some kind of, I don't know, some report on it and, kick it to the long weeds or something. But it's interesting to see whether the Conservatives will side with Reform on that and demand some electoral reform.
Yeah, it's interesting, it's how the opposition is going to play out in terms of, can an opposition unite? You've got Conservatives and Reform in fundamental competition. Will the Conservatives try and ally up with the Lib Dems and stay in that more centre? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But then some of them are going to be pulled and split towards the Reform, so they're going to be squeezed if they can't sort of agree what their strategy is. It's going to be interesting conversations going on in lots of back rooms tonight, I think.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks for this already. Rob C can Google quicker than I can, or has got the knowledge. Lib Dems had 62 in 2005. That's a record. So actually, if the exit poll is accurate, and there can be some, I think there's going to be some serious movement around these, then that's close to their record, which is absolutely fantastic. No other seats no other constituencies have declared so far. But yeah, so it's interesting to think what will happen. Say, well, tomorrow is all going to be about, Keir Starmer, one presumes, is going to be prime minister, meeting the king, all that kind of stuff, all the usual ritual that takes place. But the kind of honeymoon period, we mentioned this last night. What are your thoughts on a honeymoon period?
Yeah, who was it? Last night, wasn't it? Alistair Campbell with the stand-in for Rory Stewart. They were basically saying, Alistair Campbell saying, they had good 3 years. Have been such a long Tory reign. Thatcher, Major, what have you. At 97 was such a. I mean, loads of people just never remembered there not being a Conservative government.
It's 18 years, yeah.
Yeah, and it was, so. They had probably about 3 years of a honeymoon period before Blair's sort of shine washed off a little bit.
Which is huge.
Yeah, but he's, Campbell was saying they're not going to get anything like that. It's going to be quite short. But obviously they can't make changes. Starmer was saying, we're not going to have sorted the prisons out in 24 hours. So, and that's an interesting issue with prisons, actually. That's something that's been on my mind quite a long time. I always think it's how you treat the most unseen and the most forgotten, the most sort of lowest sort of caste or level of society, like prisoners. If we had a caste system in the UK, that would be it probably.
Well, this is why you've got to have joined up thinking, because how do you stop people going into the prison system, which is overloaded? How do we stop people getting onto drugs, etc., etc.? Okay, and crime. Well, it's about education. It's about high aspirations, which is like dealing with poverty. So it's everything is connected. Like you can't have a prison or criminal justice policy or set of reforms without considering your economic, your tax, your education, your health reforms. They are all interconnected. You've got health poverty, you've got postcode lotteries for where you're going to get good healthcare, and if you don't get, you only have to look at life expectancy varying across the nation, and to think that that's going to be health effects, also maybe your educational outcomes, and all of this is just you need to be presenting a manifesto that deals with all of these problems to get to deal with one of them.
Yeah, and I think also I'm hearing Peter Hitchens here, slightly extreme, but maybe like he would say something like, and also your culture. So maybe, like, I don't know, how does the culture support those early years for children in terms of relationships and being brought up and stuff like that? And how does that then affect your life outcomes and chances of getting into, going off the rails and stuff? So that's a bigger question, which I will not say more about.
Yes. So I'm just trying to get some live updates here. Have a look, see what's going on. Is the SNP's Flynn in trouble? My goodness. So just to let people know, so the SNP is a Scottish national party that has taken over from Labour in Scotland in terms of being the main party in Scotland. Traditionally, it used to be Labour. And in order to get over 325 seats, to get 326 seats, Labour have traditionally relied on having a good Scottish hall of Scottish Labour seats. And now with SNP over the last sort of 15 years, stopping that from happening, Labour have had a much trickier route to winning elections with an outright majority. Now, SNP have been involved in a number of scandals recently, including the previous leader, Nicola Sturgeon, her husband, being investigated for sort of campaign finance issues. And they then had another leader, Hamza Yusuf, isn't it? And then it was all pretty controversial, and you then had Stephen Flynn coming in and taking over and seeing himself as quite a steady pair of hands to kind of stop the SNP rot and get them back up. And I thought SNP would feature, I thought they'd have a bit of a bounce back and claw some of those seats back from Labour, but it doesn't look like the exit poll is supporting that. And if his own seat, look, Flynn is actually projected to fall to the Tories. That would be absolutely crazy, where the Tories are getting a bit of a spanking, and yet they are winning a seat up in Scotland off the SNP, and that could be involved in this very low SNP number there. So anyway, that's just my tuppence. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I mean, just in terms of obviously the desire to get a second referendum on Scottish independence. We were just discussing yesterday, weren't we, around the moves in Northern Ireland. So it looks like Sinn Féin is gaining ground there. So you've got more likelihood of the union breaking up in terms of a reunion of Northern Ireland with the Irish Republic. Scotland's chances of that seem more remote now by, I guess, if the SNP are.
Yeah, so we were talking about this in the pub just now, that actually this is going to kick. So look at this. If you look at that on the screen now, you have remember, this is only the exit poll, but you've got 10 SNP seats going down from 48, right? So that's an incredible destruction of the SNP. And what this will mean, this will have far-reaching consequences, because although you've got a number of SNP voters who still believe in independence for Scotland going to Labour, it's not that they're giving up on independence, but they are going to Labour to run Scotland more effectively than they think SNP have been doing. And this is a repudiation of SNP. But this also means that arguably the Scottish referendum has now been kicked to the long weeds for possibly a generation. This is really, really significant here. I think in order to consider another referendum, where if you were SNP calling for that, you'd also want to be hopeful that that referendum you could win that referendum. So you're not going to call it unless you're really confident about it. I don't know. I think this has really dented the SNP's chance of calling a second Indie referendum.
How do you feel about that?
So I was speaking about this at the pub, and one of the guys I was speaking to is in the Navy. Actually, he's just come out of the Navy, but he was saying people don't realise the impact of Scottish independence on things like defence. It's like all of our ships are built. All of our ships are built in Scotland. All of our submarines are based in Faslane, in Scotland. And if Scotland had independence, we would literally have to ring fence like part of Scotland for England. That is absolutely absolutely vital for our defence.
Be like Akrotiri in Cyprus or something.
Yeah. So like there are so many complications with I think we're better united, but then like in the same way I feel Europe is better united, but we can have our flavors of nationality within Europe. I think we have that for the UK as well. And I found it really bizarre that so many people who were up for Brexit, who were Brexit leavers, were also Scotland can't leave the UK. Like they don't get a right to self-determination, but you've just argued you have a right to self-determination to get the UK out of the EU. Like those two things didn't jive with me, and I thought there was a double standard from leavers who were absolutely like incandescent with rage that Scotland would want to leave the UK. But we should be right out of the EU. It's like, well, it's a union of different nationalities, and so that's my thought.
Mm-hmm.
I think ideally the UK is stronger with Scotland in it, and I think actually EU is stronger with the UK in it, and I actually think the UK is stronger inside the EU. But you know that. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, what do you think of? I mean, what do you think of devolution? So obviously we're getting potentially a new Labour government. So devolution happened under Tony Blair. What do you think is the connection between the SNP and a greater clamour for independence? Do you think devolution opened the potential for wanting independence more? Or do you think it kind of was like it kind of channeled it so that it would have been more likely the union would have just broken up completely?
Yeah, because devolution was a big New Labour thing, wasn't it? And I don't know because I don't know the counterfactuals. So I think devolution makes sense in terms of more direct democracy, but I don't know enough about it, to be perfectly honest. So I don't know whether devolution ends up giving people more power, or whether they want that power. I think generally they probably would, but sometimes you look at these forms of devolution, like having these regional mayors. That's a new thing in British politics, and also having a police and crime commissioner. And actually, you end up having too many things to vote for that people don't know enough. Like in the last local elections, no one really knew about their police and crime commissioners and the different policies they would have, and yet you were just voting for them because you would be reflecting your national voting tendency. You say, I'm going to vote for the Lib Dem or the Labour or the Conservative or whatever, but I don't know, So I think, how far do you take democracy, and how much power do you give to people? Well, it kind of depends on how much knowledge they have about the political system and the people what they're voting for. But I don't know. I'm probably gone off on one there. Devolution, I don't know. I presume it's a good thing, giving devolved power, so it's not centralized in Westminster, and also London centric. So what you have is a lot of money being spent by London that benefits London. And if you want to level up devolution, so to let the international viewers know what we mean by this. So the Conservative government has just been in for a couple of terms or so, have been big supposedly on levelling up. So the north of England is seen as more impoverished than the south of England, and London particularly, and everything's all London centric. So they were going to say, right, we're going to reinvest into the north of England and these poorer communities that used to be manufacturing industrial hubs, but in this decline of industry, moving to a service economy, there are huge swathes of the north that are underinvested in and that are suffering. And so we're going to level up, except they never really did that. And one of the things was building HS2, this super quick railway from the north, connecting the north to the south much more quickly. And that's been a right pig's ear. And so the end result is that they haven't done a very good job of levelling up, which is why the north is rejecting the Tories somewhat in this present election. And this is really important to understand. But I think one of the ways you could get levelling up done is by having really good devolved parliamentary structures, so that these guys can control their money more themselves. Yeah, I don't know.
Elected structures.
Yes. That get to dictate, how money is spent, rather than London deciding, so on and so forth. I'm just seeing if there are any further seats. Yep. So we've got now 3 Labour seats, which is nothing, particularly unusual. The early ones are usually seem to be up north, and generally will favour Labour. There's obviously 647 more to go. So we're not going to be here for the whole night. We're just going to be giving you a little bit of a soupçon of what the British election is and where it's going. Any other thoughts? We had some things that we were going to talk about that we forgot to talk about last night.
Just scrolling back on my iPad thing. One of the things we talked about was let's start with that one. Conservative self-sabotage, in a sense. Do we feel like it's interesting to think about the role of polling. Do you think? Is there an element? I saw some debate earlier on. Should polling, if we ban polling on election night, shouldn't we ban it during the electoral period? Because you end up with this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy aspect to it, where if everyone thinks and tells themselves, well, Labour are going to win, everyone thinks, then they start to think about the tactical voting that goes on. Actually, maybe you should have a sort of silence on that. And I was thinking about that as I was driving around the car. I was thinking, but then wouldn't foreign media come in? Because how would you control that by law? Wouldn't it end up be like the French news kind of leaking that information in? I don't know how you do. But it seems to be some sort of problem. So there, 2 questions. I'm going a bit random there. 2 questions. One, has Rishi Sunak kind of listened to the polls too much and given up, and has it been a sort of self-sabotaging kind of vicious spiral? Should we kind of ban polling information in a certain period?
Well, let's look at Rishi Sunak and his campaign. Not going to directly answer your question, but I think we'll talk about polls. So Rishi Sunak might well have fulfilled the ultimate illustration of what's called the pathetic fallacy. So the pathetic fallacy in writing and filmmaking is where weather denotes a certain mood, a certain sense of foreboding, or a certain sense of what's happening. And he announced a snap election. So this was really not expected. He announced the election for July the 4th. No one really understands why he announced it for that time. It was completely unexpected. And he came out and announced it, and it rained on him. No one held an umbrella over him. They just watched him get wet. He announced this thing with soaking suit And meanwhile, there was music blaring from the guy that often does this kind of stuff out at the end of Downing Street, who was playing the song "Things Can Only Get Better," which was the Labour 1997 election theme tune. And so he was playing that while Rishi Sunak was saying what he was saying. And then this became "Things Can Only Get Wetter" in the news. And it was all just a complete farce. And everyone's like, oh my goodness, this is an absolute disaster. Now, it's really difficult to come back from that. So when you already know you're tanking in the polls, that you're calling an election because you've got some kind of rationale that this is a sensible thing to do to try and stop the rot, and then that happens and you become a laughing stock on the front pages of the newspapers as Prime Minister, then your campaign is off to a shocking start. And especially when most of the Conservative Party didn't know he was going to call the election. No one had campaign funds up and ready. No one had campaign ideas. It was like, oh my goodness, we've got like a month to sort this crap out. And so I think if you're starting from there, and then things got worse. So there were these betting scandals that took place where then it turns out that loads of his inner circle were betting on the time, had put loads of bets on the date because they had insider knowledge. That was scandalous. And you had this whole system, this whole chain of events that just went from bad to worse. And it looked like there was just no way the Conservative Party could get out of this terrible situation, to the point where you had the scenario whereby when they did announce something good, people were dismissing it as effectively being bad because it must be bad because everything's bad. And there was nothing the Conservatives could do to put a good shine on anything that was taking place. And that just was just a PR nightmare. And the campaign was never going to work. And then all Labour needed to do was, with their Ming Vase policy of cautious, just walk this Ming Vase carefully to the end line, is they didn't have to do anything. They watched the Conservatives self-destruct and they watched Reform come along and then pick apart the pieces of the Conservative Party. And Labour have not really offered anything massively positive for everyone to go, yeah, I want to vote for Labour. People are voting against the Conservatives and they're moving to Reform, and Labour are just sitting there and reaping the rewards. And anyway, but to answer the polling question more directly, then when you're looking at the polling, so both Labour and Conservatives were worried. So the Labour campaign was worried that if it was such a foregone conclusion, then people wouldn't bother coming out to vote for Labour because they think, well, Labour have won this, I'm just going to stay at home and not bother voting. But there's some analysis to suggest that can work the other way as well. So if you're a Conservative voter and you've seen this disastrous campaign and you look at the polling numbers and see how terrible it is, then you're like, well, I'm going to vote for the Conservatives, but there's no point. Like, what's the point of me voting for the Conservatives? Because they're going to get tonked. And so actually the idea that these polling results and the campaigns suggest that you shouldn't bother going out to vote can work, keeping the voting numbers down for both sides in that.
It's interesting. Like, sometimes you sort of think, I don't think there's anything different when you think of, like, you know, elections often hinged on which way the sun pitched itself in the past. That's less important now. But you think, like, you know, it's unfortunate in a way that the elections are. This is where I come back to that sort of electoral test of what your knowledge actually is, because it just seems to be very sort of surface level or a lot of people's kind of judgment. It's that Manchester United effect, you know, that just who's winning and what team you're on, and kind of actually rather than thinking about the kind of, I don't know, the real kind of meat of the policies. I'm sure there's probably a sizable percentage of people that do look at that. But I think there's a lot of people that just kind of go with a sort of the brand and what seems to be the vibe and what's trending. I don't know.
Yeah. So this is a really good point. It was brought up in one of the analysis I was listening to earlier, which is that although that you get the idea of a shy Tory vote or a shy Reform vote, where you might go to the polls and say, I'm going to vote. Yeah, I didn't really want to tell anyone. I'm a bit embarrassed about this for whatever reason it might be, but I'm going to vote Conservative or Reform, and that sort of bumps up the numbers. But there's also this idea that people want to vote for the winning candidate. Like, I'm going to back, well, it's not Man United anymore. It would be Man City now. I'm going to back Man City. Man City, my favourite team. Why are they your favourite team? Because they win. Okay, right. So I'm going to vote Labour. I don't really know about politics, but I'm going to vote for the winning team so that I can then feel good about myself after the election, that I actually had some kind of agency there, and it was well done me, and I picked the right horse type thing. So it's interesting, different ways of looking at that. Now let's just pause this. I'm going to pause this for a second. So this is Swindon South. This is a Labour gain from Conservative. What does this tell us? So Labour have gained, and they've done a pretty good job. Conservatives have been absolutely hammered. But it's again Reform doing the damage. So Reform and Greens as well, a bit of a coup for them too there. But yeah, again, this is something that we're going to see up and down the country, where Reform, this election is going to be all about Reform. There is no doubt about this. Like, they are the kingmakers here. Labour would not have had remotely the success they're going to have without Reform. And again, that swing is a huge swing there from Conservative to Labour, but Reform have a lot to be thankful there.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it, in terms of how that plays out for Reform afterwards? Because a lot of people that would have voted for Reform would be perhaps dismissive about actually, and Farage was trying to head that really obvious point off at the pass quite often, that actually isn't a vote for you, a vote for Labour. But a lot of the electorate are going to wake up to that in the morning. People that wanted Reform, maybe ex-Conservative voters, are going to wake up to that. And what are they going to do then? Because it's like, when he's planned to gain much more leverage in the 2029 election. You think, actually, are people going to think, actually, we better go back to the Conservatives? How's that going to play out?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think just seeing what Reform will do after this election and what the Conservatives will do will be really, really super interesting, because it goes back to the idea of, like, where the Conservatives going to position themselves. Are they going to say, oh, we should, like, they can blame, you might get this argument where the Conservatives will blame themselves for not going to the right far enough, and that's why Reform did so well. Or they could blame themselves for not sitting in a moderate centre ground, and that's why Reform did well, because they didn't try and take those centre voters who went off to Lib Dem and Labour. And you'll get this argument, and it's very similar to what's going on in America with the Republican Party at the moment, about, does it go down the MAGA route and keep going down that route, but then you lose your Reagan Republicans, or does it go to the center? And in the two-party system, they really should go to the center, because the MAGA Republicans will never vote for the Democrats. So it should always be about the center ground. But this is slightly different because we've got a more fractured, pluralistic voting landscape in the UK now. And it's going to be about, do Reform and Conservatives merge to form a new Conservative Party? And therefore, like, look to 2029, and maybe Nigel Farage is ahead of that new Conservative Reform Party, because we know he's got visions of getting to Prime Minister in 2029. Or do they maintain a split and be two parties, but then Reform would be clamouring for proportional representation?
It's interesting. I watched him, someone almost, when you watch someone's body language very closely.
Yeah.
And they asked him, would you just become the next Conservative, join the Conservatives kind of thing. And they offered you leadership, whatever. You could see him, a bit of his body language, he quite liked that, was my reading of it. But his reply was like, no. He said that, the Conservatives are a broad church with no religion. What do they believe in? What are their convictions anymore? You don't know what they believe in, But there was a sort of too much of a hesitation at a moment where I thought, Yeah,
He would take that. He would love that.
And they asked him, like, would you stay? Are you staying? And he said, I'm here for the next 5 years, or until someone prettier or smarter than me comes along to take over. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. So as we've got in the stats there, Labour 4+1, so they've taken that one seat from the Conservatives, and I'm sure that sort of thing will continue. But yeah, not too much other pieces of news coming out because it's still really early. These kind of it's basically you want to set your alarm to wake up at about 3 o'clock. And that's where you start getting your 3 in the morning. UK time, it's sort of 12:25 at night at the moment. This is interesting. So the Washington Post called Keir Starmer a ruthless centrist. I love that. It's almost like an oxymoron. That. So Rob, you were sending me stuff that from like people like Peter Hitchens, who's Christopher Hitchens' brother, and he's a quite divisive figure these days in political commentary. But he was talking about how, do you know what? Keir Starmer is a Trotskyist or Trotskyite. I don't know. He was from the far left of the party, early doors, etc., etc. And it's felt to me like that he was trying to scare people into like, oh no, we don't want Keir Starmer. The reality of the situation is that Tony Blair was of the same ilk when he was early in his political sort of journey, and Keir Starmer, I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any chance that Keir Starmer is going to lurch the party to the left now that he's fought so hard to keep it centre. I was speaking in the pub, like Dave was saying, that that he's been so careful about the messaging. So as soon as someone steps outside the messaging of that like centre ground, he like keeps them back in, and it's like absolutely stay on course. And it's not exciting, and it's not going to excite the left of the Labour Party, and they might lose that. But I think you're going to see, certainly for this Parliament, Labour really fight hard to keep hold of that centre ground and see them show themselves as some kind of moderate, sensible, cautious, small c conservative party that is just going to be a responsible party, keeping things as they are. But of course, many people will claim that is austerity politics 2.0 that we saw with the Conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Hitchens says actually there's nothing moderate about what Tony Blair did. Actually,
yeah,
you might think he was very smiley Tony that came along and isn't he lovely, but it didn't mean his opinion. It's interesting. Like did he...
I would disagree. I think he was very economically moderate considering what Labour could have been.
Well, yeah, but did he actually, split? I mean, this is Peter Hitchens' view, right? But did he split the union? Did he corrupt the constitution with all the more quangos we were talking about last night? The Supreme Court doesn't even understand the English constitution effectively. You've got this oxymoron within English politics, this gradual erosion of parliamentary authority. He said it was a revolution. You don't realise how this is like from Peter Hitchens' kind of small c conservatism of carrying on the sexual revolution and the undermining culturally of what they stood for, going from the 60s onwards, and so on, and then kind of embedding the culture wars that we've got through the Equalities Act in terms of setting us against one another, in terms of protected characteristics that you might argue were intended for good things, but he says actually it divides us along those lines all the time and reinforces those things. I'm not taking a side on that, but I'm just saying he's saying that whatever way you conceive of it, it was a revolution. But it's interesting.
Just on that point though, like Blair also did like Nico.
Maybe just back up on Starmer, because otherwise we'll lose the point. But he said that Starmer was a Pabloist Trotskyite in his 20s, and then when he was asked about 2 years ago whether he still stood by those views, he said yes, he does.
Or the red-green views, yeah.
Red-green views, and he said he joined. So there were two choices as a lawyer. You could join the Labour lawyers, which were just kind of like Labour Lawyers Association, or you could join the Haldane Society, which was a Trotskyite communist-leaning left-wing group for lawyers, and it's to the point where even in the 80s he was like touring around Czechoslovakia, a country where freedom of speech had been completely hammered, and you have people put in prison, political prisoners, and what have you. And he signed up and went on a work camp during the 80s. He said, this man is a revolutionary in his bones underneath. He'll swivel on surface issues, but deep down underneath, he's
but I think you could say that about Tony Blair, and then as Nick Owen here said, selling off NHS property rent was a terrible idea. We had academisation that was brought in by the of which is like in America that's called charter schools, brought in by Tony Blair under the Labour government, which I think were bad. I think academisation has been terrible. I know it wasn't how he envisaged it, and the Tories took it on and morphed it into something that was trying to PFIs as well, and trying to take so private finance initiatives, so trying to privatise parts of the NHS, and but with academisation it's trying to cut out local authorities and give people choice of schools, as if it's like you're going down and you're choosing to buy a car. Actually, you want to go to your local school, you don't want to choose. It's like you want to take your kids to the school that's nearest, thank you very much, and so you just want that school to be the best it can be, rather than like have all this idea that you can take free market economics and apply that to education. And of course, so anyway, the point is that Blair's New Labour was a very much a centrist thing, elements of the left, but elements of the right. And I think that Starmer will be in that mold. So I think that I disagree with the scaremongering about Starmer. I think and some of those things to do with constitutional reform, I think will be a long way off, personally.
Well, yeah, I mean,
apart from the House of Lords, I think.
No, Hitchens agrees. He says that you'll have a probably fairly moderate first term. If you get a second term, then you'll get massive change. But he said what he thinks he will do, because he's got to get the money from somewhere, is hit private pensions really hard, which is what, of course, what Blair did to some extent, but also council tax will be something as well. Council
tax. So just to let American and other viewers know, council tax is the tax you pay for where your house is, and the bands you have, like how big your house is and where it's situated, means you have to pay more tax if it's if your council tax band is a higher band and you're in a more affluent area. Anyway, there is a big issue with council tax banding, and the North it actually pays disproportionately more for council houses than the South, in terms of like it needs to be sorted. So there does need to be reform to council tax banding. It means it's likely that we'll end up paying more in the South, and we'll probably complain about it and have a go at the Labour government. But actually what they'll be doing is making it fairer. And that does need to happen, but it does mean that those of us in the South, I think, will suffer a little bit. But House of Lords is a reform that most parties had on their manifestos, interestingly. So the House of Lords is our second chamber, which is non-elected, and it's a huge at the moment. It's 800? I think is it the biggest parliamentary house in the world or something like that? Anyway, they keep getting more people. And interestingly, Dave showed me this at the pub. It's like, what are they doing announcing this now? So Rishi Sunak, for his dissolution honours list, so he gets to make a couple of honours with peerages for people, which I think then they can go and sit in the House of Lords. Theresa May and Graham Brady. So people in the Conservative Party who's going to make. But why would you announce that on election day? I don't know. It's really weird. Anyway,
maybe they're living longer. Maybe that's why they were suggesting bringing in the 80% Lords euthanasia. I mean, actually, literally kill them. They can't be a Lord anymore.
After the age of 80, after the Parliament ends. Yeah. And I things like that do need to be reformed. There are too many people. You've got 29 bishops who have it by right of being a bishop. You've got some hereditary peers, so on and so forth.
There's probably not more bishops. But I wonder, I mean, is the Commons bigger than it used to be? Is that why we're getting a greater number of people sort of nominated that the Lords do? I'm sure the Commons.
I don't know. I think they just I don't know what the rules are with how many you can have, but they seem to just be growing it, and that just needs to stop. And I guess like then you'll have another party who gets in and then wants to stack the House of Lords more with their people. It's all. I think it all. Yes, please do. It all needs a reform. So a Canadian here, how do Labour compare to our Liberals? So your Liberals, Justin Trudeau Liberals. So Labour is usually left wing to the point of being, so the unions back Labour big time. That's where traditionally a lot of their funding came from. Interestingly, this time round, and this is why you know that Starmer is taking Labour Party to the centre, is that a couple of the big unions did not overtly support Labour this time, did not endorse Labour. And that is very significant, and that shows you that Starmer is indeed centrist. I don't know. I'd have to look at. I guess there's some similarities between Liberals and Labour in politics and in sort of policies. But yes, and very good. Thank you, Christopher. There, 800 is definitely too much. I prefer 10 Lords of Leaping. Very good, but it's not Christmas yet.
Some information on the House of Lords.
Yeah, please let me know.
Anyone who's remotely interested, or any insomniacs who need some help getting sleep. So, Parliament size in 1707, 558 seats, moving up to 658, 658, 652. Yeah, it doesn't actually look like it's been a lot bigger. 650 looks fairly stable in size.
So what is it now?
Obviously, haven't they?
What is it now?
650 from 2010.
Really? I was sure it was bigger than that. I will check.
You have to get over 236 to win, don't you?
Yeah. No, you're talking about the House of Commons.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Oh, sorry, I was on the House of Lords. Right. Yeah, yes.
No, just because I was wondering whether is the number of people in the House of Lords got bigger because you're getting more honours listings.
Right.
Ex-MPs that have served, what have you, and they're getting nominated, and then the House of Lords Commons is bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, because there are 783 at the moment. Lords in the House of Lords, so it is a really big house. Really,
so the Lords has grown disproportionately to the Commons, which is, and so how would that affect in terms of their ability to overturn Commons legislation? For anyone not from this
country, they can't overturn. They can only amend. So the way I understand the House of Lords is that they can't overturn bills that come through from the House of Commons, which are your 650 MPs. What they can do is delay, and they can amend, and they can send it back. And also, if it's in the manifesto, they are not allowed to do that. I think they are.
I don't think they're not allowed to. I think it says a sort of an agreement that it has. Yeah, but there's also part of Commons has. There's legislation, isn't there? Since I'm not sure when, may have been Blair, maybe one of his, really helpful democratic moves, maybe, of where the Commons could push it back again and say, no, you can't block it anymore.
Yeah. This is a really interesting stat coming in. These are forecasted votes, of course. So again, it'd be derived from exit polls. But Conservative forecast votes in the North, 24%, the Midlands, 29%, the South, 23%. This is really interesting, right? So Scotland, 10%, Wales, 18%, London, 16%. I am amazed that both the North and the Midlands have a higher Conservative vote count than the South, which means that I think Reform and Lib Dems have absolutely decimated the Conservatives in the South. Particularly, it blows my mind. I know it's not that much, 23 to 24%, but the North traditionally, compared to the South in terms of Conservative vote, with all the home counties and the affluent southern counties of the UK, I think you're going to see a lot of those southern counties go to the Liberal Democrats, and then in certain other areas you'll just have Reform massively denting that. Whereas the Midlands, it might be that the Conservatives are just held on.
Isn't not that there's more Conservative people. It's just it's a bigger drop.
Yeah. So Conservatives have done less well in retaining their vote share in the South, and that's the twin of it may be that the Liberal Democrats have had a better job of eating away at the Conservative vote in the South than Labour have of eating away at the Conservative vote in the Midlands and the North, which again might tell us that the Labour vote isn't. Labour are winning this not because they've done anything special, but because Conservatives have imploded and Reform have eaten them up, and Lib Dems have also been very targeted in how they've operated as well.
So they've dropped more. It looks to me like they've dropped more in the North and dropped more in the Midlands than they have in the South.
No, this is Conservative vote. So they've only 23%
down.
All of that, all of what I've just said is a load of bollocks then. Right, yeah. I misinterpreted it. I thought that's a total vote share.
Yeah.
So nonetheless, my point was actually salient in that I do think the South. So for those who don't know, let's go to this page. So for those of you that don't know, we're going to go to see all parties. Is this the one? Oh, I need to find a map of the UK. If you tell us something, here it is. No, okay. So for those of you that don't necessarily know how the UK is set up in terms of voting behaviour, you've got the North generally has traditionally been a Labour heartland. Although the rural counties are more likely to vote Conservative, you've got East Anglia and this kind of the rural Midlands area and the South being very much Conservative. London and these big urban areas in the North and the Midlands very much Labour. Scotland used to be Labour, but it's now SNP. But most of the map looks very blue because they're all very rural areas. Now, indeed, if we look at election map 2019, we'll be able to see this. So this one. Okay. So when we look at this election map, you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. So the very, very blue here, and this is going to change a lot, but where the South differs from the Midlands and the North is that the Liberal Democrats, you can't see that. Sorry, the Liberal Democrats in this are a party that essentially appeals, in my opinion, they're the middle class left wing party. I know they're seen as centrist, but I think they're centre left. So Labour is often associated with the working class, hence like Labour, unionised, working class, blue collar, sort of so on and so forth. Liberal Democrats are for people who are slightly left wing, but maybe more affluent, which is why the Liberal Democrats tend to do better in some of these southern countries and counties and the home counties around London, and they've traditionally been very strong in the southwest. But the Tories absolutely blasted the Lib Dems out, because what happened is the Liberal Democrats, and again, sorry, teaching grandmother to suck eggs if you know this already, but for my foreign viewers, the Liberal Democrats went into coalition for one of the first coalition governments back in 2010, and they promised, as part of that coalition, they promised their electorate who voted for them that they would scrap tuition fees, and tuition fees went up, and their voters got really, really upset with them, and a lot of them still don't forgive them for that over it, and so they lost massive loads of votes after that coalition government, as people saw them getting into bed with the Tories and really not doing a good turn for their voters, and so they lost the southwest. And as you can see, there are very few areas that are orange of the Lib Dems around the whole of the UK, because they really suffer from first past the post. And now, if they're going to get 61 constituencies now, 61 seats, you will see most of the West Country turn orange. You will see areas down south turning orange, much less so than up the north, up in the north. So the Lib Dems will be eating away at targeted seats around this area of the UK. And Reform will also be eating away at the Conservatives. Up north, Labour are going to be the ones that are really hammering the Conservatives and Reform as well. Labour won't feature so much down south, although they will, of course, pick up a lot of seats because the swing has been so vast. Anyway, over to you, Rob.
Yeah, well, just looking through the kind of live feed on the BBC, thinking that the Defence Secretary is likely to lose his seat.
So that's Grant Shapps, he's a big hitter for the Conservatives, and if he's looking like he's going to lose his seat, then that tells you that it's not a good night for the Conservatives, which we kind of know.
Yeah, Sunak, they're thinking, might hold his seat.
Yeah, the latest polling I saw was, so as I said earlier, his seat is a very strong Conservative seat, Richmond and Northallerton, and is very likely to keep that now at the moment. Although there were the most dooming of the predictions were that he was going to lose, he could lose his seat, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Farage saying 2 results in from the northeast of England, in which his party came second.
Yeah,
so the party is going to win many, many seats. That sounds like Trump, doesn't it? Sort of repeating words. Many.
Yeah. Honestly, some of it, I listened to something he was saying the other day that sounded just like Trump. I can't remember what it was, but I was like, wow. It's like, oh, that's the thing. I think it was him calling people nicknames.
Yeah, Slippery Sunak or something.
Slippery Sunak. And so I was like, oh, really? Have we got to this kind of Trumpist nicknaming? Like, come on, we're better than that. But apparently not. Labour sources pour cold water on predicted Reform gains. Some of the 13 seats forecasted for Reform UK would come from Labour. Labour are dousing cold water on that. An authoritative party source tells me our data is suggesting Reform will not win many of the seats the exit polls suggest. They would get less than 13 seats. Let's see. That could be true. Like I said, some of these seats are so marginal that there is a really wide range of possible outcomes.
It's funny, isn't it, the way they get really heated about it, as if that's going to persuade someone else to vote, travelling back in time.
Yeah. Well, it's about expectation management, but I don't think it makes any difference. So therefore, it's probably that is true. In that case, like what they're probably saying is that they really do have that. There's no point like fooling someone with spin now because you're just waiting for data to come in. So my suggestion would be that that's probably more accurate than the exit poll.
Interesting.
Otherwise they're just lying for no point.
Yeah. Interesting. Back to someone's point earlier on in the chat. So perhaps we've not been conservative enough, says ex-minister Andrea Leadsom, who was Minister in the Department of Health and Social Care under Rishi Sunak, but stood down at this election, says the strong showing of Reform UK so far suggests that perhaps it's that we've not been conservative enough, whatever that means.
I'm glad you said that because philosophical thing is, what does conservative mean here?
Yes. Asked if she can be certain that her party will not descend into civil war, she tells the BBC Tories recognise they'll have to regroup and rethink, and we'll have to be very ruthless about it.
See,
long knives.
Yeah. So again, it's going to be: do they go further to the right to react to Reform, but then lose to the centre and lose then to Lib Dems or whoever else, or Labour even, or do they go to the centre and try and retake the moderate conservatism? I mean, this is. I mean, it's going to be really interesting because I can present good rationale for each of those options. Probably the best thing, I don't know. Do you try and merge with Reform? Again, it gets back to that. But then that is moving to the right.
It's like who gets split is the strategy, isn't it? It's like can the Conservatives split Reform and take their vote share without getting split, or can Reform split the Conservatives? That is possibly the game.
That's interesting. Well, yeah, because if reform, so if you merge reform and the Conservatives, then the Conservatives will be taking on a lot of voters who are working class left wing voters traditionally. Not all of them, but there will be a number of kind of Labour to UKIP. That move where UKIP took from both Labour and Conservatives because it was mainly about immigration and coming out of Europe. And if you're going to take those left-wing voters and then say you can come and live under this new reform conservative umbrella, then you would have to then offer them something that's just beyond immigration. And if you're not going to support kind of Labour principles or the kind of the welfare state or some kind of economic tax that's more progressive or something like that, then that's going to be quite a fractious group of voters. Like I don't know how you would have a broad umbrella that included those kind of voters that are only really drawn together by positions on immigration and wokeism.
It's interesting. Like I was thinking earlier, like let's suppose the Tories get absolutely decimated. So people were talking about, this is one of the oldest political parties in Europe.
It is the most successful political party in the world, the Conservative Party.
What would your feeling be, even though you're not a Conservative? What would your feeling be if they were actually wiped out? Would that be actually a bad thing or a good thing?
I don't know. Actually, I don't know. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. It's a shame to see an institution like that. I suppose the inner conservative in me, small c conservative, would be like, what a shame to see an institution of British political history go by the wayside. I would just want what is better for the country, which is I would want a conservative moderate party, I guess, because actually that more aligns to my own politics. So that, other than that, kind of whatever. There is a question that we didn't touch on last night, which is it good if Labour get a really big majority, like a proper landslide?
That links to what I was about to ask you, following on from that, which is like, what's the sort of quality of opposition that we need?
Well, I think for particularly for this term, I am up for a big majority, because if you're going to have a new party taking over, and yes, it does align more with my politics, but if you're going to have a new party taking over, and you've had so long of the Tories trying to take us in a neoliberal direction, I think you need to have some kind of big reset. But actually, it's a centrist government that aren't going to do that anyway. But what you want to give them, I think, is a mandate to say, okay, you want change, go and give it your best shot, and you won't have many people standing in your way. So just go for it. We'll give you this parliament. You're not going to destroy the country in a way that I would say maybe Trumpism would, right? And I know that there'll be some Trump fans out there who are going to be spitting at the screen, but like, I wouldn't say that to Trump. I have a great majority, see what you can do. Like, I think this Starmer centrist government is not going to do anything crazy, but I'd like them to have as big a mandate as possible to be able to go and do things like Great British Energy Company, the National Wealth Fund, invest in loads of infrastructure in the UK, look to take us towards a green energy independent situation, and invest in education and invest in NHS. Look, if you've got big ideas about that, like, there's a lot of vagueness in their manifesto, but if you really want to affect those changes, then I'm happy to give you a really big mandate.
I mean, is there a danger with a big mandate that you are more likely to get them more crazy policies coming in? Because you're like, because when Boris had a big majority, or was it Boris, wasn't it? People were unhappy. Like, if you put your shoes on the other foot in terms of the opposite part, opposite politics to the one you like, wouldn't you kind of then say, actually, you're more likely to think you can get away with stuff? You have to be more moderate if you've got a smaller majority.
Well, I think, well, as Wizard of Ooze says here, the harder left don't have the numbers in the party to do that. If Starmer was removed, he'd be replaced by another moderate. So Starmer is ruthless, known as ruthless for a reason. So Starmer did get rid. He's really worked hard to get rid of the Corbyn legacy, and I don't think that you would get any crazy left-leaning thing. I think the big things they want to do would be quite popular with most people and would probably involve at the most like renationalizing some of the utilities, which is generally popular. Like even when Corbyn was in charge, when people will ask, do you support this nationalisation of the railway, for example, it was actually a vote winner. It was only Corbyn himself that people didn't like, but a lot of the policies were actually quite popular, which is why you see Reform UK have a nationalisation of the water, utilities and energy, utilities, energy and trains. It's like, well, that's a real left-wing thing, but Reform have taken that on because they actually know it's quite popular. So I don't think, yeah. I mean, someone says the Treasury will be ransacked. Bet on it. The Treasury is apparently already ransacked. So that one of the reasons, supposedly, that Labour are not giving a very big and bold manifesto is that the word on the street is that there is no money left in the coffers, and so they didn't want to overpromise and then get into power and then have to deliver on something that they literally couldn't afford to do. This is what on earth, says Andy S. What on earth was National Service thing about? Are they trying not to get back in? So this was an appeal to those, I think, the Reform voters that they knew that they were going to lose, and it's your middle class, affluent, over 55-year-old as well, who are like who look at the youth of today and say they're just lazy, they're not doing. I tell you what they need a bit of national service. That'll sort them out. That's the kind of voter they were appealing to. This was not something that was to appeal to young people, in my opinion. Like, it's not like young people going, oh, do you know what I really want? I'll tell you what, if they make me do national service, I'll vote for the Tories. Like, that's never the point. So this was all about appealing to that particular age group, I think, and their core electorate in the Conservative Party that I think this is probably pretty popular with.
Seems to have gone on the back burner and latterly in the campaign, but I also wonder if that chimes in with the way Ukraine's out of the news. And like a couple of months ago, it was that sort of sense of generals speaking out, saying actually we've woefully under-resourced, woefully undermanned in the armed forces as well. And like, I mean, where do you stand on that? I mean, do you think we should bolster the armed forces, and do you need some conscription to do that? But also, if push comes to shove, it's interesting the stats on the number of people that would say, I'm not fighting for this country. What does that's, do we live in an age where we constantly demand politicians perform for us and it's kind of celebrity game politics, I wonder sometimes? Or do we need a bit of a JFK stand up and say, don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country? I'm not necessarily supporting national service, but is that element of like,
so I'm not against national service in principle. What the problem with the national service decision by Sunak is it came out of nowhere and it seemed it was utterly rushed. And it was, you spoke to the experts and they're like, there's no way of doing this. Like with the vagueness that they've presented, but also like, it wasn't just a national service part. It was like, if you don't want to go into national service, you can work in the charity sector. You can't suddenly flood like 1 million 18-year-olds into the charity sector where you're going to be working with vulnerable people and they're not DBS checked. And how are you going to sort that out? And we've not got, it was just completely not thought through. So it's not the principle of national service I have a problem with. In fact, I think there's a lot to like about it. I do think we need to spend more on defense, and the problem is robbing Peter to pay Paul. There's just the same with all the parties. It's an issue with all the parties, is like, where's the money coming from? If you're not going to raise taxes because we've got the highest tax burden since the Second World War, then where does money come from? So the Labour Party are relying on a growth in the economy to increase tax revenues. You can borrow more. So instead of tax and spend, maybe it's borrow and spend. But then, people don't like borrowing, adding to the deficit. But actually, there is probably a good case to say we're not, because we're out of the EU and that has affected our economy negatively. I don't care what anyone in the live chat says. I think the stats are in that Brexit has economically harmed the UK. So our growth has been way lower than comparable countries, and just the sheer logic of trying to attract inward investment, they're going to go to Europe rather than the UK, because you get a tariff-free access to 500 million people rather than a tariff-free access to 70 million people. So unless you can give away free things to the point where it mitigates tariff-free access to 430 million extra people, by saying environmental legislation that sod that, you can pollute the environment, we'll let you do that, you can sack workers' rights can go out the window, and we'll give you tax breaks. Like, we will prostitute ourselves to attract inward investment so it comes to here, not the EU. Like, that's not a good situation either. So the economic argument for leaving the EU was always going to be a tough sell. You can sell it on immigration, and you can try and sell it on sovereignty, and I even think that was fairly weak. But you're not going to sell it on the economics, and in fact, we have suffered as a result. And so, where do you get growth from? If you're going to rule out having a closer relationship with Europe, maybe with the customs union, where do you get growth from? You have to it goes back to like what US did, New Deal post Second World War, is like, let's invest in infrastructure, which then goes back to what I like about the Labour manifesto is the National Wealth Fund and is the Great British Energy Company, which is right, let's just do some investment, money multiplier, get people working, think about who we give these contracts to, and then try and grow our economy through that.
I'd be curious where that money comes from. It was like, I was listening to something the other day and talking about like starting my meeting with people like BlackRock, and people say they're not going to want to just invest and give you money for nothing. They're a company that goes around the world spending all their time, big American company making huge profits. So it's like, okay, you kind of, on one hand, you're gonna, you can have the national debt, but you're having to pay interest on that, and you've got a huge deficit. If you get investment, there's money then going out of the country in terms of profits, because they're not going to invest in you for nothing. And also that increase that we talked about vassal state, that book yesterday, increased American control and ownership of UK shares. I looked at this morning the amount, what nations own percentage of UK stocks, and it's like, the UK, reasonable chunk. The US, it's like massive, absolutely massive. And just a number of companies that are that we think of as classic British companies that are actually American owned. I just, we can talk about in the global economy. I suppose us outside the EU makes it even worse. We are at the mercy of American corporations and the globalist whatever.
So without getting too like Brexit centric here, it's really interesting. I listened to analysis the other day talking about the trade deals that we have done with Australia and New Zealand. Like the trade one of the trade deals we did, where was it? It was it the Pacific trade deal or something, where we were like, yeah, we're going to get 50 million pounds of investment into UK. 50 million is nothing, and they were celebrating that. And then you had the people that did the trade deal with Australia and New Zealand, the actual people that did the trade deal, the Conservative MPs that did that trade deal, have now come out and said it was really shit. Like on in public, they said it was a bad deal. Like we've got no benefit, and this is. Boris Johnson was holding up packets of Tim Tam saying, yeah, we're going to get Australian candy, we're going to get Australian sweets into the UK. Really? really, like that, we've come out of the EU where we had all these amazing deals because the EU was this trade bloc that could have the power to make deals that were to the favor of the EU. Right? They were the 500 million people, big trade bloc. They go around the world saying, we're going to do a deal with you and we'll get a good deal. Thank you very much. And we, by being part of the EU, were part of those deals. So we had all the trade deals sorted out with all of the world. We came out of that. We now have to rewrite those trade deals. And when we go back to places like Japan, we are now not more powerful than Japan and therefore getting a better trade deal with Japan. We are now smaller than Japan, or like, you know, we are having to fight our own trade deals from a position of being a much smaller minnow in this pond that is the globe. And therefore the trade deals that we are getting are not as good as the ones we had in the EU. And that is simply factual, right? And that means that if we're looking at a long-term prognosis as a country and how we grow economically, we are going to struggle compared to what our prognosis would have been. And so we need to think creatively about how we're going to make money.
So, and it surprised you that Starmer completely ruled out rejoining EU or the customs union.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right what you said last night, Rob, that he said that because there must have been polls that Reform are going to be biting at their heels, because I don't think he would have said that had there not been a threat of losing Labour voters to Reform who are going to be Leave voters, because I think that's you don't want to be saying things that you can be held to. You want to be plausible deniability. We talk about this quite a lot on this channel in terms of like cyber warfare and stuff. Like you want to do things that you have plausible deniability. You can be suitably vague. Or strategic ambiguity. That's the one, strategic ambiguity. Really good question here. Talking Bloke says, where is Starmer on Ukraine? I know pro, but how hard? And who will be defense minister, I wonder? So John Healey will be defense minister. Him and David Lammy, who will be foreign minister, have already been out in Ukraine. I think you should see absolutely no change in how we support Ukraine. There is some question mark about getting to 2.5% spending on defense as 2% of GDP on defense, in terms of they've committed to it, as the Tories did as well. But there are some question marks about what the time frame for that will be, and so on and so forth. But what you've got to remember is Starmer is trying to be totally centrist and in a sense Tory light, and in that and one of the big things he's focused on, and you get this from the debates he was in and the public talking, you know, the question time sort of things that he had on BBC. Keir Starmer was very, very quick to emphasize that you can trust the Labour Party on defence. You can trust them on foreign policy. We are serious players. Where people have lost trust in the Conservatives, they are trying to be this kind of sensible, grown up in the room, the Labour Party. And so I don't think you will see any big change at all. And I think that you've got a fairly safe pair of hands with the oncoming defence minister. And interestingly, David Cameron was caught in that prank phone call from the two Russians who pranked him pretending to be Poroshenko, the previous Ukrainian president, and they phoned up David Cameron, and David Cameron said very clearly there will be no discernible change, and that's David Cameron, the Conservative, saying that. He's since come out and tried to like walk that back, but that's the truth of the matter, is that I think Labour will be fairly solid on Ukraine, and we've been really lucky in the UK to have bipartisan support, and that's why I haven't been too worried about this election, because I'm obsessed with Ukraine. I think Ukraine is safe in a way that in so many other countries it's not so clear that that's the case.
In the manifesto, there's a quote: Labour has an ironclad commitment to support Ukraine. We will fast-track military support and work with the government in Kiev to isolate Russia diplomatically and boost Ukraine's industrial production.
Which is interesting. So that is also, talking about working with the military industrial complex over there, which is something that lots of nations are doing. That's getting BAE Systems and other entities involved in actual production in Ukraine. So yeah, that's what you would expect, but it's also really good to hear that.
And also saying to take a more strategic approach to procurement, boosting British industry, reinforcing national resilience and strengthening NATO.
Yes, which is all good, but the question is, again, how do you do that? But procurement is a real problem in military and in the UK. Like our drone project, if you like, has just been blown out of the water by the Ukraine war, which has shown we don't need to spend like gazillions of pounds on these big Reaper drones, because what's more useful is loads of really cheap first-person view drones with munitions attached to them flung at the enemy. And so, we need to be much more dynamic in our procurement and much more reactive and proactive as well, and spending money more wisely than we presently are. Mitch Mazarol asks, hi Mitch, what does national service cover in broad terms aside from military service? So you can also join, like if you want to be a sort of conscientious objector, or it's not your thing, you can join like the St John's Ambulance, but also go and do community charity work instead. And I think the idea was you spend, is it a weekend a month or something like so if you're joining national service, it's not like you are going into the army for a year. It will be devoting like a certain amount of time each month to do that over the course of a year or something like that. And I don't know whether the Coast Guard would have, I think it's probably a little bit vague. So I don't know whether they would have ironed out any of the details, like whether the Coast Guard would be a part of that or not. Right, let's go and look back at the statistics, see how things are working out. Do you have anything to say, Rob?
I was just wondering, like, perhaps an alternative policy could be, to lose a reform a few votes or whatever, would be to introduce Dad's Army type kind of conscription, so people like your age, my age, have to do like a day a month. Yeah, if anyone knows about Dad's Army, from probably more British humour.
Good luck trying to get me leopard crawling under some barbed wire. That would be the comedy of Dad's Army. So we have 7 seats that have returned, plus 1 for Labour, which is the Swindon South seat that they took off Conservatives. No big news really. Let's look at live reporting. Ian Duncan Smith not out of the race in Chingford. So just to let people know, Ian Duncan Smith is a former leader of the Conservative Party. I think he was it after John Major? But anyway, former leader. The BBC exit poll earlier suggested he had a 99% chance of losing a seat, but we're hearing that it's much tighter race thanks to a big potential split in the Labour vote. The original Labour candidate, Faisal Shaheen, was deselected 8 days into the campaign and is standing as an independent. The feeling here is that it looks increasingly like a 3-way split. There are a few tense faces here at the Feel Good Leisure Centre in Walthamstow. Now,
Leisure Centre, love that. I love that. Little, maybe not so feel good.
Yeah. This is this the one where? So this is an example of where Labour are. So it's worth noting that traditionally Labour has had Jewish support and traditionally Labour has had Muslim support, right? And with the war in Gaza, in Israel, this is presenting a bit of a problem for Labour. And this is why Labour have been worried, particularly in the north, where they've got strong Muslim communities that would normally vote for them, since they have been very strong. Initially, they were super strong in supporting Israel. And that's because at the end of the Corbin reign of the Labour Party, the Tories had accused them, and lots of people had accused them of being anti-Semitic, of having an issue with anti-Semitism. This was amplified by the Tories quite opportunistically, but I think there were issues that genuinely were there, of course, as well. And Starmer's come along and he's tried to very much stamp out anti-Semitism. Also, his wife is Jewish. So this then means that Labour are in an interesting position whereby, on the one hand, they want to be strong in showing support for Israel and not being seen to be anti-Semitic. But on the other hand, they have a really strong Muslim vote in the north of England that if they lose, then they lose big time. And so that presents a real dilemma. And so their initial position on being really strong in support for Israel, I think, has been somewhat tampered. And now they are playing much more of a safe position, I think, on Israel. What's it say on Israel in the Labour manifesto there? Have you got it?
I'd have to look that up. I was looking up
All right.
something else. Yeah.
Yes. So that's I think quite interesting. So when it comes to that Chingford seat, which is in Duncan Smith's seat, I have a feeling she said something that the original Labour candidate said something that was seen as was it anti-Semitic or something a bit dodgy. So she was following hundreds of messages from my people in the community. Can't trust Labour. Penalised for describing my experiences of Islamophobia and claim there's a hierarchy of racism in the Labour Party. So I don't know if it was fully to do with the Israel conflict, but I think it might well have been. And so, yeah, that as she's now standing as an independent means that that Labour vote is split, and that will allow possibly Ian Duncan Smith to then creep his way back into winning his seat back, which that would have been a really big scalp for the Labour Party to have taken.
I mean, surely, I mean, because both parties were pretty much sort of supporting Israel, the two main parties. You would think both of them would take a hammering, wouldn't they? It wouldn't go one way or the other.
Sorry, in what respect? Sorry, it's just really
Labour and Conservatives would take a knock for anyone voting against the sort of pro-Israel stance.
Yeah, but no, not really, because Conservatives would have been most Conservative voters would have been pro-Israel anyway. So it's your left wingers are far more like both left wingers and Muslim votes, because Muslim vote. We'll talk about this next, actually, but yeah, it's your left wing. It's Labour will suffer from being pro-Palestine more than the It's difficult. Labour just gets screwed either way. I don't think Tories will. If Tories are pro-Israel, they're not going to lose any voters.
Yeah, it's interesting. You might want to get this up on screen as you go. I'll just show it very briefly there, just to show you what I'm talking about. It's YouGov. How are ethnic minority Britons intending to vote? This is June 2024. So Labour, for Black Britons, 72%, Pakistani, Bangladeshi Britons, 44%, Indian Britons, 40%.
For who?
Indian Britons, 40%.
For 40%, what? For
this is Labour. This is all
Labour.
Labour.
Yeah.
59 mixed ethnicity. Other ethnicity is a bit vague, but 48%, whatever that means. Conservatives, so 11 compared to 72.
Wow.
Black, 7 compared to 44 for Pakistani, Bangladeshi. This is interesting. Quite different. You get to Indian Britons, 32% Conservative, 40% Labour. That's quite different, isn't it? And that's really interesting, different as well when you consider Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. You know, they're not the same, obviously, but same subcontinent in culture and origin. So, like mixed ethnicity, 9% Conservative, 59% Labour. So still much more.
Yeah.
Labour.
Yeah. I think, and this is something we didn't talk about last night, but something I did want to mention is that, and this is the same in the US as well, that you get this scenario whereby immigrants to a country because they see themselves possibly as an oppressed minority, and they are needing possibly welfare or whatever, they migrate naturally towards the left wing. So Labour take on immigrant, first generation immigrant and second generation immigrant families into their electorate more easily, and you've just represented that with the difference between Conservative and Labour voting behaviours of ethnic minorities, and it's the same in the US as well. So Democrats famously get specifically the first and second generation immigrants more than the Republicans. But what there's a tension there, and the tension is that quite often, so Hispanic immigrants are very likely to be Catholic. So there's that religiosity and that conservatism that comes with that religiosity. And with regard to like Muslim immigrants from some of the countries you mentioned, they're much more likely to be very conservative. And so you get this weird situation where they go to the natural home of the Labour Party or the Democrats, but actually they're much more socially conservative. And their natural home, if they were in their home country, might well be a conservative leaning party. And so the Democrats and Conservatives have to fight. Democrats and Labour have to fight quite hard to keep hold of these. It becomes like a cultural norm rather than a natural fit. And I think that's just an interesting tension within those demographics.
What I've sent you on the Facebook Messenger, so you can pick it up there, is because we talked about maybe having space to discuss sort of what we might call anomalies, like unexpected things. So having Zia Youssef, the Muslim, so this will be really interesting in the context of this discussion, as a Muslim entrepreneur speaking at the Reform UK rally. So I've just sent you the link. Might be worth just playing and then us kind of analysing that, because that fits into what you were touching on, and how he pitches himself as well.
So this is so say that again, because I was just looking at something else.
So it might be interesting. I wonder if it's worth. It's about a 2-minute clip looking at Zia Youssef as a kind of anomaly in that regard. So you've got someone as a Muslim, Asian Muslim, British Asian Muslim. He's the biggest sponsor for Reform UK. So it just fits into that discussion we were having about that.
Of all races and faiths who love their country, a movement for those who want to see British values protected, who wish to see our culture celebrated. But let us be under no illusions. This mission will not be easy. Quite the opposite. We will have to face down the entire political and media establishment who hate us for what we love.
And of course, I wonder whether his ethnicity is represented in that audience, which is an interesting, observation. But and also you get this.
I'll give you the stats on that. But it was interesting as well, because it must counter the stats, because I remember as I watched that, and then there's an Asian girl who has her face obviously asked to have her face blurred out. She's interviewed as a pro-Reform UK person, and then she sort of says, being interviewed, she says, "Yeah, I told my boyfriend I was going shopping. He doesn't know I'm here. He votes for the Green Party, and I'm stuck off. And this is why I support Reform UK." But I don't know what his ethnic background was there, Youssef. Don't want to. But let's imagine. Let's say I don't know. Indian background. Let's say, I'm guessing, but I mean, Reform UK only has a 6% compared to say 5% following from the Indian Britons, but 40% for Labour. But then of course 32% Conservative. So maybe that is he might appeal to sort of Indian Britain's Conservative type voter.
Well, I think what you find as well, I mean, you get this in the US with someone like Candace Owens. So Candace Owens is really, I would say, quite controversial. I think she's empirically wrong with almost all of what she says, but she is a real right-wing commentator in the US that's very Republican. And because she's black, lots of white Republicans absolutely love her, because it gives them a sense of like, yeah, okay, so look, we're not racist. Candace Owens is saying the same sort of things about what we say, and this is validating our sense of a broad church. But actually, it's almost, she's been co-opted, or not even like she's grifting for that. And I don't know if that's the same with this chat, but there's certainly the sense of like it's even more valuable to someone like Reform, to a party like Reform, if you can get someone of an ethnic minority to be saying those sort of things. It's like, yeah, we're going to celebrate this person even harder.
And it's interesting, like, I suppose, like, if you think, I don't know, and what Candace Owens' wealth demographic is, but he's obviously pretty wealthy as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, well, she is now.
Is that back to your point? You know, are ethnic minorities more likely to skew, say, Labour, not on cultural grounds? Because often we know, like, Muslims are generally quite conservative, right? I mean, I know that's only one ethnic, and it's not even necessarily an ethnic minority; it's a religious group. But anyway, but like, if you're fairly well established financially, but you're culturally more conservative, might that be the factor that sort of switches you away from sort of Labour onto more kind of, I don't know.
Yeah, and there's going to be socioeconomic status, like SES ratings are going to have a lot to do with kind of who you're voting for. Here we have, I'm going to share it to this. I'm going to just move to this, but just a short explanation here. Hopefully you can hear this, of why the SNP could see its numbers fall so greatly and lose to Labour.
I think what's interesting is, why has there been such a surge in support for Labour? Lots of the voters that I've been talking to travelling around the country have been saying, one, they want to get the Tories out. They don't think they're doing a good job. I'm generalising, of course. Two, they're not delighted with the performance of the SNP, concerned about some of the other things going on with the party in terms of a police investigation into its finances and so on. But three, have I heard massive enthusiasm for Labour from voters? Not necessarily. And I think that will pose a challenge for the Labour Party to prove that they can deliver meaningful change for the people of Scotland.
And that goes back to exactly what we were saying earlier, which is the honeymoon period is not going to be very prolonged. There's going to be a lot of expectation for big change, like they've said change, but actually their sense of change is very muted. And it's going to be somewhat dependent on how much money they've got to spend. And you might get, so some people have been wondering whether this could be a short reign for the Labour Party in a one-term parliament, because they might not be able to give what people want. And we live in a society these days where you want quick, instant gratification, and you expect change, and you expect jobs, and you expect growth, and you expect this, and we want it within 4 years, and if we don't have it, we'll vote someone else in. But then expecting then, which just kind of goes back to the idea I was talking about last night, is that you want to be able to operate on a 25-year strategy, and of course with the 4-year election cycle you can't do that, and it's almost unrealistic, which is why you want to expect a kind of a 2-term success. It's much more likely that your actions will bear fruits in the second term, and I don't know that people would be willing to give that to Labour.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I've been hearing when I've been listening to stuff, is that actually this isn't people voting pro-Labour, this is people voting anti-Conservative or anti-SNP.
Yeah. Let's check out a bit of swingometer.
Actually happening. In places where they need a bigger swing, Labour are getting it. So have a look at what our exit poll is projecting. And I'm just going to wash the red across the right-hand side of the screen here, and you will see. This is the remarkable thing about Labour's performance, is that where they didn't need a very big swing, for example, in their own already safe seats, they haven't got one. Instead, they've targeted seats they desperately need. Maybe they're in second place to the Conservatives. And it looks like, from our exit poll, predictions only, at 13%, they're taking all the seats. At 14%, they're taking nearly all of them. At 15%, and you know what? We should move it around a bit more. Where does this very targeted Labour swing stop? This is the secret of Labour's victory, if victory it is. This, remember, is our prediction. It's our exit poll. But it shows them, possibly in Romford, Redditch, Herne Bay, getting seats on a swing of 20%. Now, part of what's happening is the targeting of the Labour vote. The other thing is that the Conservatives seem to be hemorrhaging most in places where they're stronger. So for them, it really is a perfect storm.
So there you go. That's a bit of analysis there. I think it was really interesting seeing Isle of Wight West on there. So we live with a view, in view of the Isle of Wight, and to see that going to Labour is really quite something.
Where was that? Isle of Wight and
Isle of Wight West. It was just one of the Isle of Wight constituencies. So goodness me. But interesting, no 1997 optimism. Labour must prove itself. And there isn't. So we talked about this last night. In 1997, the context of the Labour sweeping victory then was one on the back of 18 years of Conservative rule. So it's like, yeah, we're fed up. We want change, which is similar to now. But you were in this period of this British renaissance of like indie Britpop music, of cool Britannia was the term that Tony Blair was using, going around as a very charismatic leader, whipping up some excitement for change, and everyone had this great appetite for what was being offered. And that's not what's going on now. Exactly what you just said. And this little piece says, there's no 1997 optimism. Labour must prove itself. Lord Charlie Falconer, former Justice Secretary under Tony Blair, tells Radio 4 and 5 Live that the exit polls suggest an extraordinary achievement by Keir Starmer, but warns there is less optimism than when Blair won power. Quote, people have become profoundly unhappy about their politicians. Keir has been steady and the country is willing to entrust the leadership of the country to Labour, but they do so with much less optimism than they did in 1997. And what I find interesting, Rob, and I had this with one of the guys down the pub I was just with, and this is something I've heard so often over the last few weeks, which is it's all broken, like everything's broken, the Tories have just ruined it all, etc., 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 which is a very easy thing to say. But when I hear things like that, my question is, well, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean it's all broken? Like, you're going to work just fine, right? And you've probably have more money now than you had 15 years ago. And it's easy to, and I'm no pro-Tory, right? But it's easy to slag off a government, an incumbent government that has just been giving you more of the same by saying it's all broken. But what's the evidence there? What are your metrics of judging brokenness?
Yeah, because I mean, I think there's still been some growth. It might have been slow. So, and then you got those questions like when you've got green politics in the background. I remember years ago when I was at uni, they were talking about most of these parties are what they call grey parties, or grey politics, and not green. And you're like, we constantly talk about growth, and yet growth implies what? More consumerism, more stuff. So people are kind of, on the one hand, kind of complaining because we've, because we're warming up the planet, and then they also complaining about the bloody Tories and not giving us enough consumerism. It's like, oh, what does left and right or any of that actually mean anymore? Like, make your mind up. But I'm coming around to a sense more and more. I get annoyed at the voters. Get annoyed at people. They don't think hard enough. You expect politicians to do all the work. You expect them to change the world. This kind of abdication of responsibility. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a rant here, aren't I? Abdication. You've got to fix the world. You've got to do it all. No. What about you? What about you in your constituency and you changing your world and doing your bit? If I was a big politician, I'd be saying, stop asking what your country can do for you, and ask what you can do for your country. It's like,
yeah. So this is I guess a point in case here. So Hugo Kappas says, JP, it's broken if it isn't getting better. But then my question is, what does it mean getting better? What is getting better to you? Like, now, okay. Like, where I would say, right, where it's not getting better is the health service, right? So waiting lists. And that is something that the Conservatives have definitely failed to get a handle on. And in fact, there are two things that Labour are better at than Tories, in my opinion. And from the evidence of the Labour 1997 to 2010 rule and the present Conservative rule, one is education. So Labour threw loads of money into education, and education was, I think, in quite a good place there. There was a lot of change, but we started moving in. I just think it was a good time for education. And the other thing is health service. On data, they just had a better handle on waiting lists, and waiting lists have gone down or gone up, sorry, since Labour were in. So I think there are some ways that you can more easily say that, yeah, things are a bit broken in the UK at the moment, and the Tories are to blame for that. And Rob, ranting is a contextually transmitted disease. You've been infected by JP. I am famous for my rants, by the way. I have big rants where I just lose a plot and just get angry about stuff.
I'm just convinced there's a gene on the Y chromosome that kicks in around the age of 50. That ranting gene, yeah. So
Mark here says, look, people just want perfect and ignore what's happened, such as COVID. And I agree with that. And I think sometimes there is this unrealistic expectation of what a government can do with like 70 million people or whatever. And actually, Mark said earlier, Tories self-destructed, aided by COVID, energy crisis and war in Ukraine. I actually think that I think the Tories were quite good with COVID, actually. They did a pretty good job. And again, I'm no conservative. However, I think it was absolutely disgusting what the Tories did with regard to giving out contracts and fast tracking their mates to get massive money contracts. And Baroness Mona, for example, making like her husband putting £67 million in an offshore account based on a PPE contract, like all this kind of stuff. I think there's some absolutely terrible things that happened under the auspices of like emergency COVID provision. But in the general COVID organization and whatnot, I think the Tories did pretty well. Energy crisis and war in Ukraine is not going to help. I personally think we should have given a windfall tax to BP and Shell and people who are making record profits. But there you go. So it has been challenging for the Conservatives. There is no doubt about that. But I also think there was some imperfect activity from the Conservatives at certain points there as well. Thanks so much to Richard Bennett for gifting 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Legend. And thanks to Dr. Battery. Thanks, mate. Really appreciate that. Gifted 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships as well.
Was that an accent you were attempting there?
Yes, it was. It wasn't an attempt either. It was a successful, like it was the accent. I didn't try it. It just naturally. My viewers know that my Australian accent is one of the best Australian accents out there.
I was getting northern Peru.
What's that? What's that word? No, that's it. Twat. That was it. So we can do that. It's late night.
Is that late night? That's southern Peru.
YouTube. I'm watching. So let's just go back and see if there's been any change. So as someone said correctly it's John Larkin. Good to have you on board, John, mate. We have a +1 to the Lib Dems now. So they have taken, we're only at 10. They have taken Harrogate, I believe. That's going to be interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, but Harrogate is one of these very rural northern places, like Market Town, quite an affluent area, Harrogate. So that's the sort of place where the Lib Dems will do well in the north. That's going to be something like there, or might even be further north from there. I don't know. I just wanted to show you this, just to let you know that we've not been talking about many things coming through, because we're in this period here where there's not many seats being announced, and really we should have been doing this live at 3 o'clock in the morning, but that's never going to happen. So we're probably not going to be with you guys much longer. We've been going 2 hours 10 minutes, which I think is pretty phenomenal, Rob. So although having said that, it turns out I've got a beer that I opened when I started this and I haven't even had a sip yet.
I'm good at the moment. I'm actually not working tomorrow.
Oh, happy days, happy days. Well, so here's one. Lib Dems gain from Conservatives in Harrogate and Knaresborough. So that is a big one there. We will also want to look at this. So I was hoping that the Greens would make some serious gains, because I want to see a little bit of green politics thrown into the House of Commons. We've had Caroline Lucas from Brighton Pavilion, which is a constituency in Brighton on the south coast of the UK. Brighton is a very left-leaning city, right? It is. It's got a very big gay scene down there. It's got a very big alternative scene. It's very liberal as a city, right? And it has had a Green member of Parliament in Caroline Lucas for a good number of parliaments. And she is brilliant. Caroline Lucas is on it. Every time she speaks, every time she's on Question Time, everything she says is spot on. She's just a really good member of Parliament, but sadly she's stepping down. And there are some very real concerns that Brighton Pavilion seat will go to Labour. So the Greens could lose that one, but they're looking at gaining in Bristol and possibly in Herefordshire and possibly somewhere else as well. So the Greens expecting a very strong win in Bristol. So it's a new constituency covering the city in the southwest. Labour won the previous seat by 28,000 votes. That's a huge Labour majority previously, but it's a change, I think, a change of boundaries. It was one of the top targets of the Green Party. Earlier, we reported there were tears among the Labour team in Bristol Central, where Shadow Culture Secretary Thang Nam Debonair is facing a battle to keep her seat against Green Party co-leader Carla Denyer. There's some good jokes about Carla Denyer sounding a bit like denier, like climate denier. But anyway, that's just a private joke. Well, that's a joke of Politics Joe podcast. Former Green
there then.
Former Green leader Natalie Bennett said she expects the Greens to secure a very strong win there. She tells BBC Radio 4 and 5 Live, it's been disappointing that what Labour presented has essentially been to follow the Tory spending plans. This is what we've been talking about, to follow the same kind of austerity. I don't think that's going to be achievable. However, the Green Party manifesto was somewhat unfunded compared to the Labour manifesto. So that is a flip side there. Gloomy Tory faces in Mordaunt's constituency. So this is Portsmouth North, which is my neck of the woods almost, or our neck of the woods. Turnout in Portsmouth, Penny Mordaunt's seat, Portsmouth North, is 59.25% down from 63.9% in 2019. The result is expected in a few hours. It was designated too close to call in the exit poll, but there are some gloomy Tory faces at the count, and Mordaunt, leader of the House of Commons herself, has not yet appeared. Labour looks confident and Reform UK very chipper. I think this is a perfect place for Reform UK to slam, to cut the Conservative vote hugely, and Labour
there, but yeah.
Well, no, I think Labour will win it, but on account of Reform.
Of course, she was the candidate, the person that debating against Angela Rayner on that big multi-party debate, where they were just literally her and Angela Rayner bickering backwards and forwards. It didn't come across well, wasn't received well by the public.
And also, she did, interestingly, she had to apologise for, because that's the other, we haven't mentioned this. So the absolute debacle that was the Tory campaign. I talked about getting rained on at the beginning and the pathetic fallacy, and then the betting scandal. But in between that was Rishi Sunak going to the D-Day commemorations and then leaving early, and all these other leaders being there, and it's so meaningful and an amazing experience. And he started off early to have this interview that was a pre-record for 6 days later. So it's completely unnecessary. And then there's that hot mic, or the pre-interview bit that was caught on camera by the interviewer, who released it saying, and is Rishi Sunak saying, "Oh, sorry, I'm late. I was held up in the D." It's like really inappropriate. Like, you don't apologize for being late because you've been at the D-Day 80th commemoration.
Super bad optics. And then who was it?
And then Penny Mordaunt apologized in that debate you were talking about for him. She said that wasn't acceptable. So like the Tories were owning up to the fact that Rishi made a right
it was interesting, like whatever you make of Farage, sometimes he can be entertaining. He said one of these things on that stage I watched. He was like, the film The Longest Day about the war. He said they're making a new version starring Rishi Sunak called The Shortest Day.
Very good. Yeah, very good. We'll pop into this. We'll see if there's anything from the Beeb here. So let's listen to them for a wee second. Oh, I just wanted to listen to her.
The other side of the country, we can talk to Katie Razzle, who's in Bristol. And one of the really interesting things in Bristol, Katie, is that real fight between Thangam Debonnaire, who is the Shadow Culture Secretary, who would be very hopeful of being in a Keir Starmer cabinet, and the Greens, who have been pushing very hard. What's the mood?
Well, the mood here, I'm in the Oasis Academy. Hello, Laura. Hello, Clive. You can see Bristol East, which is one of the counts happening here, but way down the end of that corridor, that is the key one for us and for many people watching this count. That is Bristol Central, where, as you say, Thangam Debonnaire, Shadow Culture Secretary, she has a huge majority last time, 30,000 around that. But I've been in there pretty recently, having a look round as the people are counting, representatives from all the parties are watching as those votes are being counted. And I have to say, there is only one set of party representatives in that room looking happy, looking confident. And that is not the party predicted to win a landslide at this election. It is, of course, the Green Party. They are using very sober language still. Carla Denyer, the co-leader, is about to arrive here, and they're talking in very sober terms, just saying they're optimistic and it was great on the doorstep. But someone from one of the smaller parties who's been in that room for a long time told me she thinks the Greens are storming it in Bristol Central, and it certainly looked that way to me when I was in there. Of course, it's early days. We're not going to find out till 3:15, but there have already, it looks to me like been some Labour people who do look pretty devastated. I was talking to somebody who was saying that even as they were trying to get their vote out on the doorstep, even as late as 8:30, 9 o'clock tonight, people were saying, I'm sorry, we really like Thangam, but we're going to vote Green because, I mean, what this person was saying, in a sense, there's no jeopardy. If you think there's going to be a Labour landslide, it's okay in a seat where you want to support the Greens to do that without any jeopardy. And that seems to have been,
it's a great point.
Potentially, if that is what swings it, but that is one of the reasons why this has happened. But there's a lot of faces, sad faces here, but we're going to wait for at least another hour and a half until we know what's happened.
I think there's a lot to be said for kind of momentum as well. So the Bristol City was a really interesting, Bristol Central was a really interesting constituency because there's a lot of young people there. Again, it's quite similar to Brighton in it's a very liberal sort of area, and I think when people start talking about, I'm going to vote Green, and then you get a lot of interviews taking place. You get a lot of vox pops. There's a lot of media coming into town saying, "Oh, you guys looking like you're going Green." And again, it's kind of what you're saying earlier, this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where it feeds into itself, and the media interest whips up a momentum that then leads to, and especially like, well, I'm going to vote Labour or Green, but actually Labour are going to romp it, so I might as well vote Green. If we can get another Green MP, and then hey, that's really cool. And yeah, I fully can understand that there could be a massive swing from Labour to Greens in such a constituency.
And that seems to be one of the things that Reform have been trying to do. So if you listen to the rhetoric in their like conferences, it's this constant talk about the optimism and there being a movement and a sea change out there and stuff like that. So trying to capitalize on that sense of actually be part of the stream of the movement, you know. Yeah.
Is Rob, so are you Rob from Bristol, Rob C? Because I need to put this together. If you are Rob from Bristol with Rob and Denisa, that's really cool that you're hanging out. If you're not, this is a random question. But are you saying that you haven't felt a Green surge in Bristol among friends and family? And yes, it is you. That's excellent. Does it depend on what constituency you're in? Are you in the Bristol Central? I don't know. Anyway, random, like talking across the live chat there. Yeah, interesting. I want there to be a bunch of Green MPs in Parliament because I think you need to reflect the proportion of proportional representation means that those millions of Green voters should be represented with more than just one MP. So I think there should be a suite of Green MPs, and that will add to the conversation that takes place in the House of Commons and to the challenges. Like, I want Green MPs to be able to stand up, like a number of them, and say, no, we were going to hold you to account on doing X, Y, and Z. That is for the benefit of the environment and climate and whatnot. So
the difficulty is as well is that because it's the joke, isn't it, that the Greens are a bit like a frog in a liquidizer. It's not very pleasant joke, but it's like green on the outside, but actually you cut into it, it's kind of red on the inside.
They are supplanting Labour. As Labour have drifted to the centre, the Greens are saying, well, look, we are the left.
It'd be interesting to see what would happen if you had and even could you, in the current climate, a conservative Green, because there is actually a small conservative Green. It's quite a strong tradition of countryside preserving.
So
nature.
the main Conservative Green MP actually quit the Conservative Party only like a few months back
to join the Greens.
I'm done, you guys suck type thing. Like there is a Green contingent in the Conservative Party, but he I forget his name. I'll look that up. But he was really disenchanted with the direction of. He's more of a one nation. Rory Stewart's actually got a Green streak to him as well. Like these one nation Tories that are like, I'm conservative, but I understand. That I believe in this kind of one nation, this much more embracing conservatism, and he just felt that wasn't a place for him in the party, in the direction it's been going in, and with the decisions it's made on the environment as well.
I mean, do you think the Greens would do well to leaf out what we were talking about earlier, that reforms strategy of having their kind of issues, but also going actually in some of their policies to the left of Labour? Nationalising railways and rail mail, whatever, would the Greens do well to actually have some real kind of more right-wing policies?
Well, I think they're doing that, right? So although not quite as big as, say, right-wing policies. I was talking about this with you last night, Rob, when we talked about real hope, real change as being their statement on their manifesto. And I was talking about this with Dave at the pub, that they, I think, have taken a leaf out of European Green parties that have become realistic parties of parliament, where they're in coalition with, say, in Germany, they've been in coalition with the CDU, they've been in coalition with the SPD, and that means that they are serious about ruling, which means they can't have these crazy, impractical, idealistic policies. They have to kind of temper that with some more kind of, I don't want to be pejorative here, like grown-up policies, because I don't mean it like that, but you know what I mean. And I think the Green Party,
it's a realistic, pragmatic, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the Green in the UK have done that. Like, for example, they've switched on NATO. So they were anti-NATO before. Now in 2023, they switched to embracing NATO, and that being the correct thing for the UK to be part of. So
but only if you've got recycled tanks.
This is electric tanks.
Electric tanks,
yeah. So I'm just going to go back and see whether any. We'll give this about another quarter of an hour, guys, I reckon, and we'll see how it goes. So if we're gonna, I'm just going to open this for a little bit more and then share this for you. See if this. So we have 12 seats now declared, +3 for Labour, +1 for Lib Dems, and they're 1, and Conservatives have lost 4. So nothing too unusual. Now, this is a fascinating subplot. So just to let people know from abroad, particularly, so Jeremy Corbin was the leader of the Labour Party for a number of years, and actually Keir Starmer endorsed him, and that's been rather controversial because people are trying to poison the well of Keir Starmer by saying he's associated with Corbyn and he supported him, and Corbyn's now this really unpopular figure. But actually, Corbyn was sort of very popular amongst a certain group of Labour voters, and he attracted a load of Labour voters as well, or voters to the Labour Party, because he was this old school Labour anti-establishment, if you like. He often voted against the party whip. He's been very consistently pacifistic. He's had very staunch positions on, say, Israel and Gaza. This is before the latest iteration. And he took Labour in a leftward direction, which is what a lot of people have been longing for Labour to be. So Labour under Blair had gone very centrist. Under Starmer, it's gone centrist. But Corbyn took it to the left, which is actually traditionally, it's where Labour is traditionally and should be, right? Or should be, whatever. But they then got a bit of a tonking in the 2019 election. And that was a repudiation of that kind of positioning, even though actually some of the policies were deemed as quite popular. Like I said earlier, Corbyn himself wasn't popular amongst swing voters and, say, Tory voters that you might want to attract to Labour. But if you ask them whether they were up for X, Y, and Z, actually they were. But he was portrayed as this kind of Soviet type left winger.
He'd been fine if he'd had a different haircut. Again, I come back to this like image over content of the modern world. Like, Blair. We were discussing the other week, weren't we? The psychology around actually the correlation between looks and success.
Yeah.
He didn't look schmoozy, sexy.
Yeah. It's tweed suit kind of man. And so he has then, because under his leadership there was these anti-Semitism claims. When Starmer came in, basically Corbyn was deselected. So basically Starmer went about kicking out all the left wingers from Labour. So this is why I'm absolutely confident that Starmer will. I'm not saying this is a good or bad thing. I'm just saying I'm confident that Starmer will keep the party centrist because he's purged the party of anyone on the left. He's got rid of really the core kind of Labour side of the party.
Hitchens says he thinks Starmer is actually to the left of Corbyn, deep down, but he might
well be, but it doesn't matter.
But you've got your kind of Diane Abbott's and your Jeremy Corbyn too. The sort of lefties, and you can see them and smell them coming from a mile away. And you've got your schmoozy lefties who know how to play the game, they play the long game. But I'll read a quote here from Jeremy Corbyn's Facebook page on what you were just saying there, so he says, "Dear residents of Islington North, it's been a huge honour to represent you in Parliament." This is a day ago, by the way. "I have fought 10 general election campaigns in Islington North, but this one has been different. For the first time, I've been prevented from standing for the Labour Party against the wishes of the local people. And that's why I'm standing as an independent candidate. I hope people who have always supported Labour will understand that I'm here to represent you with the same principles I've held my entire life: equality, democracy and peace. These principles are needed more than ever. When I vote in Parliament, I do not vote alone. I vote with my community and I use my voice to stand up for the values we share. As an independent MP, my priorities will be to end two-child benefit cap, support rent controls, bring water, energy, rail and mail to public ownership and stop the privatisation of the NHS. Win or lose tomorrow, I will continue to speak out for peace in Palestine, Yemen, Ukraine, Sudan, West Papua, the DRC and elsewhere." Wonder what he means by peace in Ukraine. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah. So he's probably going to be more of an appeaser. But he's then running as an independent, so that's going to split the Labour vote. But I think either one are still going to get through. So I don't think Tories still have a chance of getting in. So the question is, will the Labour candidate that's been pitted against him have success and kick him out? And that'll be a really big win for Labour if that happens. And I think the polling suggests that actually Labour will win and Corbyn will lose. But there have been, I think, some differing results. Now, Conservatives
are Labour now.
Hey?
13 seats to Labour now.
Yeah.
One earlier.
Conservatives have won their first one, and it's Mark Francois. I'm not a fan of him, so he definitely sits on the right of the party. But yeah, so they have won that one with a 5,500 majority.
Where's that?
In Raleigh and Wickford. I don't know where that is actually on the map. Labour gain from Conservative in Nuneaton. So that is going your Midlands way, isn't it? Nuneaton. And Darlington, Labour, that's right up north. That was one of these possibly surprising seats that the Conservatives won last time, but I presume Darlington would have traditionally been Labour. Correct me if I'm wrong, someone out there. And recount in Basildon and Billericay. Veteran Tory MP chose not to stand. Tories won a majority of 20,000, and it's that close. Goodness me. Right, there's lots coming out now. Labour holding. What else? Deeply painful night to be a Tory. Oh my goodness. Former Education Secretary Nicky Morgan. When I was working in education, I didn't like her. I just want to throw that one out there. Anyway.
I didn't like any of them. I mean, I just have to say, I mean, the Tories would underfund everything, but Labour would micromanage everything down to the hilt.
Yeah. No, I don't know. Labour just threw money at education, so I kind of like that. Yeah. So 15 plus 4 for Labour, 1 minus 5 for Tories, 1 plus 1 for Lib Dems. So not a huge set of seats being declared at the moment, as you would expect at this time in the evening. I'm just going to see if there's anything worth listening to on the old Beeb.
That Basildon and Billericay one, like, if it turns out there's like contested Conservative reform votes, is there going to be sort of Trumpist style? We've got a recount going on. They're sort of ringing some bells.
So I don't know what's going on here. Don't know if it's worth looking into that. So we have Leeds West declaring. Let's listen to a bit of declaring.
I'm not getting sound.
Oh, you're not?
No. I've got the same picture you had a minute ago.
Is duly elected.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
For the Leeds West and Pudsey constituency.
The woman highly likely to become the next Chancellor of the Exchequer, the first woman to hold that job. And she's about to give her victory speech. Let's listen in.
Another fan of an extreme left-wing Trotskyite is one of her philosophical heroes.
The privilege to have been returned as the Labour Member of Parliament for Leeds West and Pudsey. Let me begin by thanking the returning officer, the counting agents, the polling clerks and the police who make elections possible. Let me also thank the other candidates in this contest for the campaigns that they have run. I want to thank my team.
So it goes into the usual kind of ritual of going through this stuff, and then she'll say some wonderful things about how amazing Labour are going to be. She's one to watch. So for the international viewers, or for any viewer, Rachel Reid will be fairly prominent in British politics because, and she's had a pretty good swing there as well to hold on to that anyway. But she will be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so she will be in charge of the purse strings in the UK. So very important member of the cabinet there. Yeah, sorry, I wasn't playing that before, and you could hear the big old cheers when news came through. Yeah, so that's to be expected, but that's worth noting because she's such a major player. Right, as I guess we kind of meander towards a close at some point fairly soon. I'll go and give my voice a rest and sit down and watch the rest with finishing my beer and then drinking copious amounts of tea until some point in the morning. I do have to say that right, yeah, okay. So I was going to say that I don't know what my output tomorrow will be for my Ukraine stuff. It will happen, but it just won't happen as early as possible. And I'm just looking up. Is there anything you want to say while I just look up something?
Not really. Can't really think of anything just to fill the gap. Well, I do need a cup of tea, I think, or a coffee. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is proportional representation. Proportion. So what are the advantages? So the advantages obviously are that everyone gets represented in Parliament, that your vote actually means something. So what happens at the moment is that you, in first past the post, for example, if you go back to that Leeds vote that we just saw, in fact, if I can get that back up and maybe pause it at the right place, you'll get a sense of, yeah, so this is it. So let's go back to that. So here, I'm going to get rid of you, Mark, sorry. So here you can see that all of the people voted in this constituency for all these different candidates, and 18,976 people voted for Labour. All of these other votes here now have absolutely no kind of value, if you like. All those other votes are effectively thrown in the bin. They're not worth anything because she won and everyone else lost. So thank you very much. I'm going to go and represent all of these people. All of these people get represented by Rachel Reeves in Parliament in Westminster. And imagine that this was repeated right across Britain, right? And you had consistently this kind of result where Labour won every single seat and no other politician got in, but all to these kind of similar numbers, then you would have no representation at all for any people voting for other parties other than Labour, or for people who didn't win. And say you had, so as an example, imagine that Conservatives here got 30% of the vote in every single constituency. They got 30% of the vote because
JP, I've got the stats on the screen over here. I can say, so you've got at the moment, Reform looks like they've got 20.7% of the votes they're estimating.
So that's to say that imagine if you spread that equally among every constituency, they'd have 20.7% of the votes in every constituency. But if they didn't get first past the post in any given constituency, then they get 0 MPs. They're on track to get how many?
So it's not looking like maybe 14, reckon, but then no, that's not. I'm looking at the wrong stat. But it's interesting. Like Liberal Democrats have only got 9.4%.
And yet they are going to get 61 seats, and because it depends where your seats, where your votes come from in that seat. Now, under proportional representation, what you would do is you count up that 20.7% of the votes across the country. If that's what I don't think Reform are going to get that many. If it's, they might do, but say they get 20% across the country on first past the post, they're going to get, I don't know, somewhere between like 5 and 13 MPs. But actually 20% of 650 is what, 10? That's the, how many is that?
10% would be 60, so double it, 120.
Yeah. So they should have 120 seats and they're getting 15, tops 13, right? And so therefore the first advantage of proportional representation is that people get their views reflected in Parliament, no matter who you vote for, as long as you get over a basic minimum, so you can get at least, you know, one candidate's worth of votes, then you are getting represented. Everyone has democratic power. Now, the disadvantage is, how do you work that out geographically? So if you've got 20% of votes across the UK for Reform, but they don't win in a single constituency on first past the post, on proportional representation, how do you apportion that 20% of MPs when you have a localized geographical representative democracy? So where do you put those 20% of MPs? And so that is one of the challenges for such a system, because you might have someone put into your area that is like Reform, but actually most of you in that area voted for Conservative or something like that. So there are loads of challenges. And so I would have to look into getting a big old list that gives you advantages and disadvantages.
The other major one, obviously, is like lots of European parliaments that have PR or something like it. Often take a long time to be able to form coalition governments. So, like Belgium or Netherlands, for example, just taking like 6 months to a year to actually arrange who's going to share what with who. Yeah.
But the good thing is that quite often when you get these coalition governments, the extremes on each side of the coalitions get their the extremities get kind of sanded down, if you like, and they become moderated by a coalition. So, for example, in Belgium, you've got a coalition of a number, not Belgium, in the Netherlands, you've got Geert Wilders' PVV is in coalition with a number of other parties, but those other parties will say, look, we will go into coalition with you, but we're not, if you're going to go with that bonkers rule that you want, that no one else is up for, then we ain't going to do that. So they have to drop some of their crazier stuff. And it means that coalitions generally are more moderate governments. We had a coalition in 2010 with the Lib Dems and Conservatives, and everyone was talking about how terrible a government it was going to be. You're not going to get anything achieved. Everyone's going to be arguing all the time. And I think it's historically it was the most effective government in getting the most things passed. So it absolutely blew that argument out the water. We've got some arguments here on the screen. So the advantages of a PR electoral system, moving to proportional representation may offer in the UK may offer it's not very good English, would give minority parties and independent candidates a better chance of winning seats in Parliament. Current first past the post system is considered unrepresentative, as candidates can be elected with a very small share of the votes, while the other votes cast in the constituency are wasted. So, for example, in, say, Fareham, one of my local constituencies where Suella Braverman is running, she might get in with 35% of the votes, and 65% of the people there actually don't like her. But because they're split amongst all these other parties and they all get lower than 35%, she wins, even though most people don't like her in that constituency. And that therefore can be very unfair. PR ensures that parties would have to appeal to their core supporters rather than a small number of so-called swing voters in marginal seats. It could be argued that PR delivers fairer treatment of minority parties and independent candidates. Under PR, fewer votes are wasted as more people's preferences are taken into account. PR potentially offers greater and more representative choice for voters. So there's more reflection. People's individual choices, you end up getting more parties and you get better reflection. Someone in the pub tonight was saying, oh, I used to vote Labour, I'm voting Reform tonight. So he voted Reform today, but he said there's no party that really represents who I am. And that's because we probably don't have just enough parties in the UK, although we have got more than we used to have. And PR potentially offers more representation. PR may encourage turnout and reduce apathy. PR rarely produces an absolute majority for one party. However, it could be argued that PR ensures greater continuity of government and requires greater consensus in policy making. So that's the idea, that you moderate things because there's more consensus, because you're working, together, and so on and so forth. Disadvantages: under first past the post, MPs serve the constituency they campaign in. That's a geographical issue I was talking about. This makes them more inclined to tackle important local issues. PR can potentially provide a route for extremists to force their way into the political mainstream. Under a first past the post electoral system, this would unlikely happen. So there is a truth to that. So one of the drawbacks for PR, if you say, for example, if you really hate Reform, no offense to Reform here, but say you hate Reform because you think that they're too extreme, on first past the post, it means there won't be enough in each individual constituency to get them over the line. And so they get really very few seats. But under proportional representation, those extreme parties that are, particularly at this time when they're growing in popularity, get more representation in Parliament, and then that gets them having more effect on policy making and parliamentary activities. And so there is an argument that you can get extremes in a little bit more. The question is, would they actually go into coalition though? Some would say that PR produces weak coalition governments rather than strong majority governments, which arguably can lead to indecision, compromise, and even legislative paralysis. That's the argument, but actually, I don't think that it seems like that would logically be the case, but it doesn't seem to be. Doesn't seem to be particularly the case. I mean, as mentioned in 2010 in the UK, PR can also reduce accountability to voters, as an ousted party of government can retain office by finding new coalition partners after an election. The adoption of a PR list systems weakens the link between the elected representative and his or her constituency. So that's that local geographical thing. And there's a greater complexity as well, requiring to have greater knowledge of individual and party positions. I think that's a poor argument because I think that's bloody useful. I think that's good. I think if it makes people get more, have to get more interested in politics then and knowing their political parties, and that's a good thing.
Just show you on my phone actually that you've got there the sort of vote share by the party at the moment, so you can see Labour there at the top, and then Reform beating the Conservatives underneath.
They're beating. Is that what's been returned so far? Yeah,
that's based on the exit polls on the BBC. Yeah,
is that the exit poll?
I guess so. Yeah,
because that's huge. That's huge. But yeah, check that. See whether that is based on the exit poll or whether that's from the ones that have been returned so far. Because I imagine that. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's changed since 2019. So yeah, Reform up 14%, Labour up 1.7%. Right?
So yeah, at the moment.
Oh yeah, Conservatives down 20%.
Yeah, there you go. So Labour 21 plus 8, Lib Dems plus 2 on 2, Conservatives down 10 on 1. No others there. And Labour just holding some ones you'd expect them to hold. Wow. So Mark Francois, who won by 5,500 in Rayleigh and Wickford, is a 26% drop, is the biggest one ever. Easily the biggest fall in Conservative support in a seat ever. And it is the 5th biggest drop vote in British electoral history. But he did hold on to the seat. So actually, even though he held on to it, he got an absolute pasting.
57% turnout, down by 7.5% on the last election. Yeah, did we mention that earlier?
Yeah. So, yeah. Lib Dems are feeling pretty confident. 61 seats would be good. They won 11 the last time, so that would be very good for them. So anyway, I'm just going to pop to the BBC, see if there's anything particularly interesting before I start thinking about wrapping up.
Eastleigh's gone Liberal in our area.
Oh, has it?
From the Conservatives.
So yeah, Lib Dem Eastleigh. So that's one of these southern, slightly more affluent areas, I guess. It's not hugely affluent, Eastleigh, but it is. If I can find where the, not the exit poll, I want this here. Underneath, we should have. No, where's it gone? Where's my map of Britain? Oh, well, we haven't got it. Oh, there it is. What's there? There it is. So Eastleigh is there. Yay. So just to let you guys know, this is where we live. Where is it? It's that one, isn't it? Gosport. We are in the Gosport constituency, and we can see the Isle of Wight. Isle of Wight has 2 constituencies, and one of them is expected at least to go Labour, and that would be insane. That would be quite incredible. Yeah, there's not a lot of colour on the map at the moment, but you can see most of it is red, so that is something. Anyway, are there any questions in the live chat? Just going back to that proportional representation, although there are quite a few arguments both ways, for me, like the weight of the argument of having enfranchisement and having representation is so much bigger than the other arguments. It's like the point of voting is that I have some kind of power to dictate, and I demand that my views are somehow taken into account in the way this country is run. And on first past the post, at least half of the votes in the UK are thrown in the bin, probably, or at least a certain amount. of votes in the UK just thrown in the bin. And I think that is absolutely criminal in terms of a democratic system. So, yes, it does have some advantages. And by the way, there are lots of very confusing and there are varied alternative vote systems. So you can do it in lots of ways. You can also have like quite a simple one like ranked choice as well, where
a hybrid between first past the post and so you had like, you know, you look at what your overall kind of outcome like with what we'll have tomorrow morning, and then you also then look at the vote share and you kind of, I don't know, multiply one by the other in some way and comes that as a compromise between the two. But then where do you put the party? Where do you put the MPs?
Yeah. And that's kind of like ranked choice, which or you get the two vote system like in France, where they like vote and then they get rid of the crappy ones at the bottom and then they vote again, and then whoever wins that second vote. So at least you get a chance of like, my vote didn't count that time, but then I can try and make it count the second time. So you get a kind of second bite of the apple. But yeah, Mitch, this is super kind of you. By the way. ATP geopolitics, more than slightly off topic here, but notice the lack of a link to ATP geopolitics versus ATP and Philo merch in the video description. Selfishly, I'm hoping to see some rant merch as ever, thanks for the relentless content. Thanks, mate, and that's really kind of you to support. Is there no merch? Have I not got the link? Oh, I was a bit crap in sorting out my my description. Thank you, Mitch, for letting me know about that. And yeah, because let's face it, this is I love this this hoodie. This is a thin hoodie, and it's one of my favorites. So anyway, I'm not going to spam.
What's rant merch?
Just because I rant so much, so it's gonna have something to do with rant. Put on some merchandise or something like that. So just to someone is saying, oh, somewhere gone to reform. Just have to look into that in a second. Someone asked, this has already been asked, Andrew, but I will answer it again for anyone that's just joined. It will not change. If Labour win, there will be no significant change to support for Ukraine. And that is, I think, fairly... I'm very confident about that. So the defense minister and the foreign minister to be are very strongly in support of Ukraine, and it's part of the Labour manifesto, and they're trying to sell themselves as a sensible centrist party. And I think that's the answer to that one. So Lee Anderson in Ashfield, so he's quite a big hitter for the Reform Party, isn't he? Quite controversial, I think, as well, if I'm correct. So let's go and pop into that one. In fact, we may have that on the TV if it's a big bit of news. Yeah, here we go. So let's see. We'll rewind that.
Oh my God, they've got to see.
Oh, So, and that's a big old. He's returned a pretty big majority as well, I think.
Say, there's not vision for Labour to rebuild that infrastructure.
The Green Party, 1,100. Daniel Holmes, Liberal Democrats, 619. Ria Keane, Labour Party, 11,553. Debbie Solomon, Conservative Party candidate, 3,271.
Well done, Debbie.
Jason Zadrosny, the Ashfield Independent, putting people before politics, 6,276.
Not bad. An independent.
So Lee Anderson becomes the first Reform MP of the night. He, of course, defected to Reform from the Conservatives. His majority there, 5,509, and again, a relatively low turnout. But the Conservatives and an ex-Brexit party representative there, beaten into 4th place, and Labour into 2nd place. So that Reform's first MP and first.
And that was to be expected. So he was a former Conservative member of Parliament, defected to Reform, as you heard. And that meant he would have taken a lot of his Conservative voters with him, not only, attracting the Reform voters who have got disenchanted with the Conservatives, but also people who are loyal to him personally and like him as a constituency MP and whatnot. So that is to be expected, and was probably one of the most certain Reform wins there. That is Ashfield, which is, I think, in Nottinghamshire, if I'm correct. And so, yeah, a big win there for them. Good news if you're a Reform voter and you want to see Reform doing well. Just to say, there's a thank you very much, Mark, from the little whiskey shop. I really appreciate that. That's really kind. And he helped with, he organised that talk on Ukraine I gave all the way over in Stockbridge recently, and I really enjoyed that. So thank you for sorting that out. I would like to post the talk online, but unfortunately there were technical issues on both sides, both Mark and my own. And so I will probably just re-record my talk personally with my to you with my talking head with my PowerPoint behind. Yes. Anyway,
Starmer's lost his seat.
Eh?
Yeah, just joking.
So I think that's an interesting thing. The fact that we have our this might be the last sort of little talking point, right? I think it's a bit of an issue having a prime minister that has to have a constituency seat. Such a busy job. Like, what can Rishi Sunak, for example, do in his constituency seat? Like going to surgeries to listen to people complain about a freaking noise on the road or something, or potholes, which they often do. Like, Rishi Sunak's too busy sorting out the country, mate. So I do think that. I think there's a case to be made that I'm not saying that we should go down a presidential route, but
no, then what do you do? Because then they're unelected.
It
has to be. So it has to be elected person. But like, I'd imagine what you would do, you would
proportional representation,
delegate the role out, wouldn't you, to people in your surgeries and that, you'd employ staff, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I was just reading something a bit different there. Yeah. I don't know how you sort of proportional representation could probably solve that in some way. But Reform support falls as Labour win Barnsley. The exit poll had the Conservatives down 22 points in Barnsley North, Labour down 2, and Reform up 19. In reality, Labour did much better, increasing by 12 points. Reform support actually fell back slightly, while the Conservatives declined 16 points. So, yeah, there are going to be ups and downs. It's going to be not quite as smooth as people would think in any particular direction. Quite noisy. Clacton, which is where Nigel Farage is running, that was previously a UKIP seat that went to UKIP when Douglas Carswell defected from Conservatives to UKIP. Douglas Carswell then won it back in 2017, was it? And then this is now being seen as the safest place for Nigel Farage to run, and he's looking like he's going to win now. I'd eat my hat if he doesn't win in Clacton, I have to say. Right. Anything else to add, buddy, on what's going on?
No, I think it's probably a good time to sort of wrap things up. Do you?
Yeah, I really appreciate all of you guys hanging out, listening to us like bumble on and talk nonsense. I will try and get out my normal content tomorrow. I really appreciate you guys who supported the channels. That's Richard Bennett, Dr. Battery, Mitch Mazarol, who is just a freaking legend in his own underwear, which is good. I'm not wearing anyone else's. And Mark as well from the Little Whiskey Shop. Totally cool human beings, one and all. Thank you very much, guys, and thank you for being part of this and the channel in general. It's going to be an interesting time ahead in terms of Ukraine. I think it's going to be fairly solid, so we're all right there. in terms of domestic politics in the UK, is it going to be, the question is it going to be more of the same, or are we going to see anything genuinely change in the UK? And that is the big question. Love hanging out with you guys as well. So United We Ride. Thanks, JP and team. Love hanging out with all of you. Toodle pips, y'all. Take care. Rob's hang on online. Here is.
I was going to say, if anyone ever wants some psychology, philosophy, spirituality type stuff, you're always welcome to check out Transcendent Psychic channel as well. Don't leave Jono's channel and watch him less, because that'll just be rude.
Please do, actually. So Transcendent
Psych. Yeah.
Transcendent Psych. Words, too many beers, is a great channel. Please check him out. I should have said that. I'm really sorry, Rob. Toodle pips, y'all, and speak soon. Bye.